Victorians didn't just grieve, they performed grief. Publicly, loudly, and with the sort of rule book that made passings feel less like an end and more like a long-term career move. If you've ever felt bad about not replying to a text fast enough, imagine living in a world where showing up to tea wearing lavender 2 weeks too early after your aunt's funeral could get you socially blacklisted. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic how Victorians tried to invent a phone to the afterlife, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. At the very heart of this melancholic melodrama was Queen Victoria herself, the woman who made black the new black. When her beloved husband Prince Albert passed away in 1861, she didn't just mourn, she launched a personal grief brand. She wore black for the rest of her life. Not for a few months, not for a couple of years, but for 4 decades. That's not mourning, that's a commitment. And as it turns out, when a monarch spends 40 years dressing like a haunted widow, everyone else decides that's just the fashionable thing to do. Suddenly, mourning wasn't just a feeling, it was a social contract, a competitive sport, and a multi-step process with color-coded stages. The grieving didn't suffer quietly, they suffered aesthetically. Victorian mourning fashion wasn't your average funeral outfit. It was an entire genre of clothing: black crepe, heavy veils, matte jet jewelry, and fabric so dull it could make a raven look cheerful. Deep mourning was the first and most brutal phase. You couldn't wear silk, you couldn't wear buttons that reflected light, you couldn't even wear lace unless it was dyed the right shade of void. Widows especially were expected to go full goth. They wore long black gowns, stiff bonnets, and face-obscuring veils so suffocating that more than one woman fainted at the gravesite, not from grief but from heat stroke and poor ventilation. Even handkerchiefs were dyed black, because nothing says emotional devastation like blowing your nose into the abyss. There were rules for when you could start lightening up your palate. Enter half mourning, which sounds like a polite way to say emotionally exhausted, but still legally obligated to be sad. Here you could introduce lavender, grey, and mauve, colors specifically chosen to scream, "I'm healing, but only just." You couldn't jump the gun, though. If you wore grey too early, society would think you were disrespecting the passings and had questionable taste. Scandalous. But this wasn't just a case of national sad girl energy. The obsession with mourning had deep cultural roots. The Victorian era was a time of extreme uncertainty. Industrialization was reshaping cities, science was threatening religion, and the average person was one cholera outbreak away from spontaneous combustion. Passings was everywhere. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly common, plagues still popped by uninvited, and funerals were basically a full-time gig for most families. In a world that unpredictable, people clung to rituals, and mourning became a ritual they could control. Society built a kind of emotional scaffolding around loss, one that said, yes, everything is horrible, but at least we all agree to wear black for 6 months. Passing, strangely enough, became a unifier. Mourning was something everyone did, rich or poor, old or young. The only difference was how dramatic you could afford to be about it. Wealthier families hired professional mourners to cry at funerals. Poorer families pooled money to get at least one decent photo before the body cooled, but we'll save that twisted gem for later. For all its fashion and formality, Victorian mourning wasn't purely performative. There was a psychological element too, even if they didn't know it at the time. Grieving in stages, dressing the part, avoiding social events, it gave people structure when their lives had just been turned upside down. The outfit said, "I am broken, but I am officially broken," and that makes it marginally more manageable. Of course, that didn't make it any less exhausting, especially for women. A widow was expected to drop out of society for at least a year, sometimes 2, and live in decorative seclusion. And if she did decide to remarry after mourning ended, she was often judged for moving on too fast. even if she waited 3 years in a séance, because that's the Victorian paradox in a nutshell. Grief had rules, but also expectations, and both were equally impossible to meet. So when we talk about why Victorians were so invested in talking to the passings, it's not just about séances and ghost gadgets. It starts here, in a society where mourning wasn't a passing feeling, it was a public duty, where the pass-away wasn't hidden away. It was invited in, dressed in crepe, and given a seat at the dinner table. Grief wasn't just felt, it was choreographed, and if you didn't follow the steps, people noticed, loudly. Picture it, a quiet candlelit Victorian parlor, velvet curtains drawn, a lace-covered table in the center, 7 respectable people, holding hands with tense expressions, silently waiting for a ghost to RSVP. It's not a horror story, it's a Tuesday. Welcome to the golden age of séances, the socially acceptable way to hang out with the pass-away without being labeled completely bonkers. While most people today unwind with a movie binge, the Victorians preferred to ask invisible forces if they'd like to knock twice for yes. But this wasn't some underground fringe movement. No, this was mainstream paranormal fun, and it exploded across the drawing rooms of England and America like a ghost with a flair for drama. Spiritualism, the belief that the pacings could and did communicate with the living, began its rise in the late 1840s, just in time for a global population that was teetering on the edge of a collective existential crisis. Science was marching forward, but faith was faltering. Industrial cities were full of pollution, disease, and the constant thrum of new machines. People were dying faster than ever, and traditional religion couldn't always keep up with the grief. Into this uncertainty wafted a new idea. What if your loved ones weren't really gone, just relocated to another frequency? Suddenly, ghosts were accessible. They weren't lurking in crypts, they were ready to chat over dinner. It all really took off with the Fox sisters in New York, who claimed in 1848 that they could communicate with a ghost in their home via a series of rapping noises. Was it probably just them cracking their toe joints under the table? Almost definitely. Did it matter? Not really. They went on tour like a boy band and started a full-blown movement. By the time it reached Victorian England, spiritualism had become a polished act. And the séance? It was its shining centerpiece. The séance had rules, or at least vibes. The lights were dimmed, candles were lit. Everyone sat in a circle, usually around a table that had no idea it was about to become a paranormal trampoline. Participants were told to place their hands lightly on the surface and wait. Then came the thrills. The table would creak, it would tip, it might spin, shake, or float, ever so slightly while everyone gasped dramatically and pretended not to peek under the cloth. Table tipping was the karaoke machine of the séance. Sure, maybe you weren't actually talking to a Victorian butler who died of consumption in 1832, but the performance was half the fun. Then there was spirit writing, where a medium would enter a trance and scribble down a ghost's messages. The results ranged from eerie love notes from the beyond to chicken-scratch doodles that vaguely resembled shopping lists. Some séances involved spirit boards, an early form of the Ouija board, or trumpets that ghosts were supposedly using to whisper secrets. Nothing says credibility like being told by an invisible voice that your cousin forgives you for stealing his watch. The séance had its stars, mediums. These were people, often women, who claimed to be able to channel spirits through their bodies or through objects in the room. The best mediums could converse with multiple ghosts in one evening, produce knocking, tapping and faint glows, and go into full mode where their voice changed completely and they suddenly knew Latin. Convenient, since many ghosts apparently refused to speak English. These mediums weren't just social novelties. They became celebrities. They toured the world, charged handsomely, and appeared before royalty and high society. Some wore elaborate costumes, others brought props, and a few were so good at faking it, even skeptical scientists left the séance room feeling like their gone goldfish had forgiven them. Of course, many were eventually exposed as frauds, but by then, they'd already made their money and become legend. Why did this become a regular part of evening entertainment? For one, it was cheaper than the theatre. easier than hosting a ball, and far more thrilling than charades. But also, everyone had someone they wanted to speak to. Passing away was omnipresent in the Victorian era, but closure was hard to come by. Séance gave people a sense of connection, a belief that their loved ones weren't really gone, just hovering nearby, waiting to be buzzed in like ghostly Uber drivers. It was emotionally charged, slightly ridiculous, and undeniably compelling. There were rules, of course. Never break the circle, don't mock the spirits, and for heaven's sake don't light the gas lamp too early. You'll scare off Cousin Bernard. Some people genuinely believed their houses were full of benevolent spirits. Others were just excited that something finally made the wallpaper feel interesting. And when things got dramatic, tables flying, voices moaning from the walls, most people didn't question it. They loved it. After all, who needs a boring game of whist when your coffee table is trying to ascend to heaven? The séance wasn't a fringe activity. It was practically a leisure class staple. It offered comfort, excitement, and just enough candlelit chaos to keep the neighbors intrigued. Sure, nobody ever got concrete answers. And sure, sometimes it was clearly just Margaret wiggling her foot. But the séance wasn't really about evidence. It was about feeling like the veil between worlds had lifted, just long enough to whisper, "It's okay, you're not alone." Now, whether or not the afterlife actually RSVP'd is still up for debate. Before telephones connected the living, Victorians were busy inventing ways to connect with the non-living. And while séance circles and table tipping got most of the ghostly glory, there was a lesser-known but gloriously absurd gadget in the paranormal toolbox, the spirit trumpet. Yes, if you've ever imagined a ghost whispering secrets through a shiny metal cone like it's auditioning for a haunted brass band, you're not far off. These devices were exactly what they sounded like, long, horn-shaped instruments used during séances to amplify ghost voices. Because in the Victorian era, if the spirits were going to offer life advice or scold you for marrying that cousin nobody liked, they better do it loud and theatrical. The spirit trumpet was essentially a ghost megaphone, usually made of tin, papier-mâché, or brass. It looked like something between a soup can on steroids and the world's most haunted musical instrument. Mediums would place the trumpet in the middle of the séance table, and after some dramatic candle lighting and hushed anticipation, it would start to rattle, float, or best-case scenario, emit a voice. Not a clear voice, mind you, more like someone gargling underwater while reading Victorian tax records. Still, people loved it. It was enough to make a believer out of your skeptical uncle, especially if the ghostly voice correctly guessed his favorite jam flavor or the name of his deceased parrot. But let's not get carried away. Most spirit trumpets weren't exactly examples of cutting-edge engineering. In fact, many were hilariously rigged. Mediums developed all sorts of tricks to make the trumpet appear to move or speak on its own. Some hid thin wires connected to their chairs or clothes. Others had assistants crouched behind curtains whispering through tubes. A few particularly acrobatic mediums could even throw their voices into the trumpet, ventriloquist style, while pretending to be unconscious. Nothing quite says legitimate spirit contact, like a mysterious voice asking for a cup of tea in the exact accent as the host's nephew. Despite the trickery, or perhaps because of it, spirit trumpets became incredibly popular. People didn't seem to mind that these gadgets looked like repurposed plumbing tools. What mattered was the sense of mystery, the drama, the feeling that someone on the other side was breaking through the static. And in a world still recovering from plagues, war, and general Victorian gloom, that kind of emotional theatre was worth every penny. For the mediums, the trumpets were both a prop and a symbol. A séance without a trumpet was like a magic show without a hat. Sure, it could work, but why deprive yourself of the flair? The trumpet added credibility, or at least spectacle. It moved, it whispered, it occasionally floated, although the floating bit was often the result of a foot nudge under the table or a very committed medium with excellent toe strength. In one famous case, a trumpet was said to levitate and chase a skeptical journalist around the room. He never figured out how it happened, but he did leave the séance covered in bruises and extremely polite for the rest of his life. There were even cases where multiple trumpets were used at once, allegedly so that multiple ghosts could talk at the same time. In practice, this usually meant the room echoed with overlapping ghost voices shouting things like "Ethel," or "the key is in the drawer," or "tell Jeremy he's still a disappointment." Sometimes no voices came at all, and the trumpet just sort of sat there like a disappointed ghost waiting for better Wi-Fi. Still, silence didn't stop people from believing. In fact, it made things feel more authentic. After all, maybe the ghost just wasn't in the mood. To believers, the spirit trumpet was a breakthrough in spiritual technology. It meant that ghosts could bypass vague table raps and deliver clear spoken messages. And to be fair, many séance goers reported incredibly personal and moving experiences. A familiar phrase, a nickname, a childhood lullaby. When heard through the eerie echo of a spirit trumpet, even the most skeptical heart could flutter. The device became a bridge between grief and closure, fact and fantasy, all wrapped in tin and candlelight. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Scientists and skeptics were quick to point out that most spirit trumpet sessions conveniently took place in near total darkness, and that the voices always seemed to have suspiciously local accents. Some mediums were caught red-handed or red-footed, moving the trumpet manually, but debunkings didn't kill the trend. If anything, they added to the mystique. After all, what's more Victorian than doing something ridiculous, getting caught, and then doubling down because it's fashionable? By the early 20th century, the popularity of spirit trumpets began to fade. Other methods of contacting the passings took center stage, and electricity replaced candlelight as the séance setting of choice. But for a brief, glorious period, the spirit trumpet reigned supreme, the ghostly gadget of choice for anyone who wanted to ask the passings important questions like, "Are you at peace?" or "Did you borrow my brooch in 1876 and forget to return it?" If ghosts had customer service, this was the hold music system. Tinny, echoing, slightly confusing but unmistakably Victorian. By the late 19th century, the Victorians had practically turned chatting with the passings into a national pastime. Parlors were lit by candlelight, hands were held in circles, and if the dog barked during a séance, it was probably just a ghost trying to RSVP late. But into this foggy mix of spiritualist flair and theatrical hoaxes stepped one man whose name practically glows in the annals of invention, Thomas Alva Edison. And when Edison just hinted, that he might be working on a device to talk to spirits, the world collectively gasped, clutched its mourning veil and said, "Wait, what?" Let's rewind to set the stage. Thomas Edison by the 1920s had already revolutionized modern life. He brought light to the night with the electric bulb, gave sound a home in wax cylinders, and turned the phonograph into the original music, minus the playlists and with a lot more cranking. So when a man with that resume starts talking about building a machine that lets the passings drop in for a chat, you at least listen and maybe nervously hide your Ouija board under the sofa. The so-called spirit phone entered public imagination, thanks to a series of interviews and rumors swirling around Edison in his later years. In a 1920 issue of the American magazine, he gave an interview that stirred the ectoplasmic pot. In it, Edison said, "I have been at work for some time building an apparatus to see if it is possible for personalities which have left this earth to communicate with us." Cue the Victorian public losing its collectively black-clad mind. Of course, that line was all anyone needed. It was as if Beyoncé had announced she was joining a ghost hunting team. Spiritualists leapt at the news. Mediums pre-booked their technical upgrade appointments. And skeptics rubbed their temples, muttering something about scientific integrity. But the real mystery wasn't whether people believed it. It was whether Edison himself did. Despite that tantalizing quote, the world never saw a working model of this spirit phone. No blueprints, no patents, no public demonstrations where a ghost whispered boo into a copper wire. Edison biographers have debated whether the whole thing was a prank, a misquote, a misunderstanding, or just one of those moments when a very old, very tired inventor decided to say something spooky for the headlines. He did live through the era of yellow journalism after all. Some historians argue Edison was being tongue-in-cheek, He was, after all, no friend of the spiritualist movement. In fact, he spent much of his career debunking mediums and psychics, calling their tricks little more than glorified carnival routines. So why on earth would he suddenly pivot to ghost gadgets? Well, perhaps it wasn't so sudden. Edison was a man obsessed with the idea of persistence, light, sound, energy, motion. His inventions all revolved around capturing fleeting moments and making them repeatable. What is a phonograph, really, but a way to trap a voice in time? From that angle, building a machine to communicate with the dead wasn't such a leap. It was just another attempt to preserve the intangible. Still, one can't help but notice the convenient timing. The 1920s were a spiritualist boom period, partly thanks to the devastating losses of World War I. Grieving families were desperate to believe their loved ones could still speak from beyond. If there were ever a moment when a new invention promising ghostly chat lines could make headlines and sell newspapers, it was then. Cynics argue Edison simply saw an opportunity and capitalized on it. After all, by 1920 his reputation had plateaued. He was still famous, yes, but Tesla was the new darling of weird science. Radio was replacing phonographs, and public interest was shifting. In that light, dangling a ghost gadget in front of the media might have been Edison's way of saying, "Don't forget, I can still blow your mind." There were even whispers that Edison had been inspired, or depending on how you look at it, provoked by Tesla's eccentric claims. Tesla famously believed he could communicate with Martians using radio waves. So perhaps Edison thought, if Nikola gets aliens, I get ghosts. One-upmanship, but with more funeral vibes. Yet, for all the speculation, no spirit phone ever emerged. And by the time Edison passed away in 1931, the idea faded into rumor and legend. Some say he left behind pieces of the device, hidden in his lab. Others say he scrapped the project when he realized no one from beyond the veil wanted to return his calls. Still, the legacy of the spirit phone lingers. It symbolizes the bizarre intersection of science and belief that defined so much of the Victorian and early modern eras. Here was a man who brought electricity to the world, flirting maybe earnestly, maybe not, with the idea that technology could also light up the afterlife. Because in the end, the Victorians weren't just obsessed with pass-away, they were obsessed with order, understanding and progress. And if you could harness the power of a battery to speak across oceans, why shouldn't you try to call your ancestors? By the time the 19th century was halfway over, Victorians had already done what they did best, turn a spiritual crisis into a technological opportunity. You see, once you've accepted the idea that the dead might be hanging around with time on their ectoplasmic hands, the next logical step is to build increasingly elaborate contraptions to chat with them. Enter the golden age of ghost gadgets, a world of strange machinery, rattling coils, and devices that looked like rejected props from a haunted Jules Verne novel. This was the era of paranormal paraphernalia, and inventors were tripping over themselves to build the next big thing in interdimensional customer service. You couldn't just light a candle and ask nicely anymore. No, now you needed a toolkit that looked like it came from a Victorian Radio Shack run by Dracula. Let's begin with one of the earliest and loudest inventions, the electromagnetic ghost detector. These devices were based on the cutting-edge science of the time, which, to be fair, was still figuring out how magnets worked without invoking sorcery. The idea was simple. Ghosts, being mysterious and non-corporeal, might disturb magnetic fields when they moved through a space. So if you hooked up a coil, a needle, and a bell, because of course there's always a bell, you might catch a spirit red-handed, or at least make it ding before it vanished into the wallpaper. These detectors often took the form of boxes with little wires sticking out, buzzing occasionally for reasons probably unrelated to ghosts but absolutely blamed on them anyway. Sometimes they reacted to drafts, static, or the cat brushing past, but that didn't matter. In the Victorian mind, a random ping in a dark room wasn't faulty wiring. It was probably Great-Uncle Horace dropping by to complain about the will. And that's only the beginning. If electromagnetic detection was too subtle for you, you could try your hand with automatic writing machines. Now, automatic writing had long been a favorite of mediums, who would claim to channel a spirit's words through their hand, resulting in pages of frantic, spidery handwriting that looked like a chicken had gone through an existential crisis on paper. But Victorians weren't content with the manual part. They wanted machines. Inventors designed bizarre devices where pens were suspended on pivots or attached to weighted arms, allegedly moved by ghostly hands. One such machine even resembled a mechanical octopus with a quill fetish. The operator would sit near it, enter a trance, and then, as the ghost made its grand literary entrance, the machine would begin to twitch and scratch its way across the page like a haunted etch-a-sketch. These devices often produced the same kind of writings mediums were already faking by hand, except now there was a gadget involved, which in true Victorian fashion made it seem much more legitimate. If your handwriting looked like gibberish before, well, now it was technologically sanctified gibberish. But no roundup of ghost tech would be complete without the crown jewel of Victorian absurdity, the ghostograph. Yes, that's its real name. It sounds like a novelty Halloween printer, but it was presented with the full confidence of a man who believed ghosts had excellent penmanship and were just waiting for the right stationery. The ghostograph was supposedly a device that could record communications from spirits by translating psychic vibrations into written messages. One version involved a plate of glass under which carbon paper was placed, connected to wires and metal rods that would twitch, allegedly under spiritual influence, and draw out letters or symbols. So basically a ghostly etch-a-sketch with more flair and less success. There's a certain charm in how utterly hopeful these machines were. They were less about engineering precision and more about wishful thinking with a dash of copper wiring. Their creators genuinely believed they were tapping into a higher frequency, as if ghosts were broadcasting on a radio and all you needed was the right antenna and a bit of faith. Of course, skeptics weren't exactly impressed. Scientists pointed out that many of these machines responded to vibrations, air currents, or a particularly heavy sigh. Some ghost detection boxes were so sensitive they went off if you coughed near them, but to the die-hard believers those reactions were proof. Because what else but a ghost would get annoyed by someone clearing their throat in the séance room? The Victorian love for these devices also had a deeper psychological root. In a time when death was omnipresent and often sudden, people desperately wanted assurance that life continued beyond the veil. Machines gave them a sense of control. Instead of relying on mysterious mediums with suspiciously wiggly toes, they could turn to something that beeped, buzzed, and scribbled like it had a soul of its own. So yes, some people genuinely tried to use these gadgets to dial grandma, and sometimes, instead of gentle wisdom from the beyond, they got messages that sounded suspiciously like someone smacking the desk with a spoon. Or, as one medium once claimed, they accidentally contacted a very irate 17th century baker who hadn't yet forgiven someone for stealing his secret gingerbread recipe. But that was all part of the charm. For the Victorians, the line between invention and imagination was thin, especially when it came to the afterlife. The machines didn't need to work in a traditional sense, they just needed to offer a glimmer of hope, a little drama, and the possibility that someone on the other side was still trying to reach out, even if they were using equipment held together with glue, gears, and good intentions. The Victorians didn't just believe in ghosts, they formed committees about them, because nothing says serious science like men in top hats earnestly discussing spectral breezes and phantom footsteps over tea and crumpets. Welcome to the wonderfully weird world of 19th century ghost hunting, where séance tables met scientific method, and the afterlife was just one good experiment away from being a peer-reviewed journal entry, while the drawing rooms of England buzzed with spirit trumpets and flickering candlelight. A different sort of crowd began to take an interest. These weren't mediums or mystics. These were scholars, professors, doctors, the kind of people who normally argued over calculus proofs or the proper way to classify algae. And yet here they were, earnestly measuring cold spots in parlors and timing ghostly knocks with a stopwatch. In 1882, the Society for Psychical Research (SPR) was founded in London, and things went from quirky to formally peculiar. This wasn't your aunt's tarot reading circle. This was an organized group of scientists, philosophers, and intellectuals who believed that ghostly phenomena could and should be studied with the same rigor as chemistry or astronomy. Their goal? To bring spiritualism out of the shadows and into the laboratory, all while wearing three-piece suits. The SPR was, in many ways, the first paranormal research organization of its kind. Its members included respected minds like Frederick W. H. Myers, Henry Sidgwick, and even William James. Yes, that William James, the father of American psychology. They weren't there to gawk at levitating tables. They wanted to get to the bottom of things. Was telepathy real? Could apparitions be photographed? Was your great-uncle really haunting the upstairs loo? Or was that just bad plumbing? Their methods were surprisingly advanced for the time. They interviewed witnesses, cross-examined mediums, ran controlled experiments, and published detailed reports. They even established a classification system for hauntings and psychic phenomena. This was paranormal investigation, Victorian style, complete with data tables, academic footnotes, and occasional existential dread. One of the society's major interests was debunking fraudulent mediums, and believe me, there was no shortage of those. Victorian mediumship was practically a competitive sport, and with fame and fortune on the line, plenty of people were willing to fake a little ghost for a lot of cash. The SPR's investigators would attend séances and sneak in hidden lights, secret cameras, or even bring along trained magicians to spot sleight of hand. You could say they were the original Ghostbusters, except instead of proton packs, they had notebooks, monocles, and very stern expressions. Some of the busts were legendary. Florence Cook, a famous medium who claimed to materialize a spirit named Katie King, was once grabbed mid-session by a skeptical observer who discovered that Katie had an awfully similar shoe size and hairstyle to Florence herself. Whoops. Another medium was caught making ghostly knocking sounds using her toes. Let that sink in. Toes. But to be fair, not everyone in the SPR was a full-blown skeptic. Some genuinely believed there was something mysterious going on, even if it wasn't necessarily the souls of the departed tapping out Morse code from the great beyond. They theorized about psychic energy, telepathic impressions, and subconscious projections. Some even suggested that hauntings were echoes of traumatic events, like spiritual replays stuck on loop. In short, they weren't all yelling fake, but they were yelling things like repeatable phenomena and controlled conditions, madam. And of course, this ghostly science fever wasn't confined to Britain. Across the Atlantic, the American Society for Psychical Research, ASPR, joined the cause. The New World wanted in on the spooky academia, and American thinkers, including psychologists, philosophers, and a few hobbyist ghost hunters, brought their own flair to the metaphysical microscope. Ghost hunting clubs cropped up in universities. Spirit photography was analyzed, and at least one physicist tried to explain apparitions using electromagnetic theory and a lot of hopeful math. In many ways, these societies were the spiritual, pun very much intended, ancestors of modern paranormal investigation. They laid the groundwork for everything from ghost hunting TV shows to EMF detectors. And while many of their findings were inconclusive or outright debunked, their work showed that people were desperate to understand the unexplainable, not just fear it or laugh at it. Also, let's not overlook the fashion. There's something beautifully absurd about a room full of intellectuals trying to measure a ghost's mass with a spring scale, all while dressed like they're going to a royal wedding. Paranormal science might not have found definitive proof of the afterlife, but it did prove that curiosity, no matter how spooky, wears a waistcoat and speaks in very proper grammar. In an era where there is a big word saying inequality, they found an unlikely and surprisingly slimy loophole: spiritualism. As it turns out, if you claim to be a vessel for the spirits of the dead, society would not only let you speak in public, they'd pay good money to watch you do it. And thus the medium was born. Specifically, the female medium, wrapped in lace, mystery, and occasionally ectoplasm. Victorian spiritualism offered women a rare path to power. It was a stage where a young lady, typically considered too delicate to read Darwin, could suddenly command a room of wealthy patrons by communing with the dearly departed, in parlors lit by candlelight and the occasional strategically swaying chandelier. Women channeled spirits, spoke in eerie voices, and convinced half of polite society that they were bridges between this world and the next. This wasn't just quirky party entertainment. Mediums became household names. Florence Cook, a teenager from London, famously summoned the spirit of Katie King, who appeared in full ghostly form during séances. Spoiler, some skeptics noted Katie bore a remarkable resemblance to Florence in a wig. Nevertheless, believers swore they'd seen the dead walk, talk, and flirt at their local ghost gathering. Meanwhile, Florence basked in her popularity, stepping outside the rigid confines of Victorian femininity through spiritual performance. Things didn't stop at whispery voices and dimly lit ghost chats. No, Victorian séances escalated into theatrical productions featuring a substance known as ectoplasm, a supposed ghostly residue excreted by the medium during contact with the spirit world. And how was this mysterious substance delivered? Well, often through the mouth, nose, or any other orifice the medium deemed spiritually convenient. Ectoplasm looked like everything from cheesecloth to damp tissue paper. Sometimes it resembled gauze, sometimes it was just gauze, but audiences were mesmerized. In the glow of gas lamps, and guided by the solemn hum of spiritual hymns, mediums would enter trances, writhe dramatically, and produce ectoplasm in ways that were, well, medically questionable and dramatically delightful. For some performances, ectoplasm would stretch out like ghostly spaghetti, sometimes forming crude faces or even hands that waved to the stunned crowd. It's the kind of scene that would make a modern horror movie director either clap or sue for plagiarism. Researchers, skeptics, and even the occasional disgruntled family member tried to expose these stunts for what they often were: elaborate, fleshy frauds. But that didn't stop the Victorians from believing and buying tickets. What made these performances even more fascinating was the gender dynamic. In a time when women weren't supposed to speak their minds, mediums spoke for the dead. When women were expected to be modest and invisible, they became the centers of rooms filled with astonished and occasionally fainting onlookers. There's a paradox here that the Victorians never quite solved. Spiritualism was at once subversive and socially acceptable. As long as a woman framed her power as coming from beyond, people let her use it. Some scholars today argue that spiritualism functioned as a quiet feminist revolution. In channeling spirits, women could express themselves intellectually, emotionally, and even sexually in ways that were otherwise unthinkable in their daily lives. They could be loud, commanding, even frightening, all under the guise of being possessed. It was a role society could stomach, even if it came with billowing cheesecloth. Of course, not all ectoplasmic escapades were equal. Some mediums became adept at sleight of hand and showmanship. Others were outright charlatans, stuffing gauze into hidden compartments in their corsets and dramatically regurgitating it mid-séance. One infamous photograph from the era shows a woman with what appears to be a crude, cartoonish paper face on a stick, emerging from her mouth, presumably representing a spirit. The level of commitment was impressive, the believability slightly less so. Despite increasing skepticism, spiritualism's popularity endured into the early 20th century, even as photography and film began to debunk some of the more ridiculous stunts. Many Victorians clung to their faith in mediums and the mists of the beyond. For every fake ectoplasm scandal, there was another person desperate to speak to a lost loved one, willing to believe in whatever theatrics the medium offered. Ultimately, the world of women mediums and ectoplasm is a bizarre, empowering, and occasionally disgusting chapter of Victorian life. It was equal parts showbiz and séance, with a dash of feminist rebellion and a pinch of cheesecloth for good measure. These women weren't just performers, they were entrepreneurs, spiritual guides, and in many cases cultural disruptors wearing crinoline. When it came to Victorian spiritualism, death didn't just haunt people's hearts, it padded their pockets. Ghosts weren't just ethereal reminders of loved ones lost, they were high-value clients, entertainment providers, and most importantly, a lucrative revenue stream. And if you thought your local psychic's crystal ball was suspiciously from a department store clearance shelf, wait until you hear about the enterprising Victorians who made a career out of afterlife networking. In the 19th century, spiritualism became more than a belief system. It was a booming industry. Entire careers were built around coaxing whispers from the veil. And these whispers came with itemized receipts. Mediums didn't just dabble in the spirit world for free. Oh no, for a modest fee, plus a surcharge if you wanted a message from someone particularly dead. You could summon your dearly departed and have a good old-fashioned ghostly Q&A. Séance were the premium product in this supernatural service sector. But not just any old séance. There were deluxe packages, dim the lights, hold hands with strangers and prepare for a performance that felt like a mix between group therapy and a low-budget magic show. Some séances included table tipping, eerie voices in the dark, ghostly caresses, or even floating trumpets, all included in the experience. The more theatrical the event, the more convincing it seemed, and the more likely you were to leave feeling like your great-uncle Barry had truly dropped by to say, "Nice waistcoat, still ugly," but like any profitable venture, demand brought out the grifters, and Victorian England was positively crawling with ghost entrepreneurs. These weren't your kindly neighborhood mystics. These were seasoned con artists with a flair for drama and access to fishing line. They faked messages, manipulated furniture, and occasionally employed their children to crawl under tables and scratch people's ankles at key moments. If someone told you that your grandmother had a message, there was a very real chance that message came from a 9-year-old apprentice in a cupboard. The spiritual consulting business extended beyond séances. There were entire studios offering ghost photography, pictures where the dead photobombed the living. These were achieved through double exposures, clever lighting, and the occasional well-placed bedsheet. But clients were convinced. Why wouldn't they be? When grief meets hope, logic tends to exit the room quietly with its hat in its hands. One of the most famous spirit photographers, William H. Mumler, even claimed to have photographed Abraham Lincoln's ghost, who conveniently hovered lovingly behind his widow Mary Todd. Spoiler, Lincoln never made that appointment. Mediums also offered custom services, locating lost wills, advising on marriages based on ghostly opinions, and even helping with business decisions. It was like Yelp, except instead of reviews, you got messages from a guy who died in 1732 and really hates your wallpaper choices. There were also celebrity spirits that toured the psychic circuit, long-dead poets, composers, and warriors, who allegedly popped in regularly to dictate new sonnets, offer life advice, or just remind everyone that they used to be famous. Mediums claimed to be conduits for Shakespeare's latest musings or Napoleon's regrets. If you were particularly lucky, you might get a note from Cleopatra, assuming she wasn't already booked for another séance down the street. And of course, no ghost economy would be complete without merchandise. Books explaining how to develop your psychic abilities flew off the shelves. DIY séance kits became a household staple. Spiritualist newspapers delivered fresh from the beyond gossip columns. Some even sold patented devices to help detect ghostly presences at home, essentially early versions of ghost hunting gear that blinked, buzzed, and did absolutely nothing, but looked spooky enough to justify the price tag. But as with all booming trends, a backlash brewed. Skeptics and investigators began to crack down on fraudulent mediums. There were exposés, staged stings, and court cases. Famous debunkers like magician Harry Houdini made it their personal mission to expose the tricks of the trade, especially after watching people prey on the grief of others. And while many spiritualists claimed purity of intent, plenty were caught red-handed with ghost arms made of cheesecloth or pre-written messages hidden in their corsets. Still, the business of death carried on, because no matter how many fake ghosts were unmasked, the desire to connect with the lost was too powerful to extinguish. It didn't hurt that many Victorian families found comfort in believing that their loved ones were still hovering nearby, offering encouragement, or in some cases, demanding a better headstone. In the end, Victorian spiritualism was a curious cocktail of hope, trickery, and capitalistic hustle. It was grief with a ticket price, belief wrapped in theatrics, and a bizarre moment in history where the afterlife doubled as a side hustle. Long before the internet convinced us that printers were haunted, Victorians were already suspicious that their latest tech gadgets were secretly communing with the dead. As the Industrial Revolution marched full steam ahead, bringing beeping, buzzing, and ticking devices into parlors and drawing rooms, a new paranoia took root. What if all that noise wasn't just mechanical? What if it was supernatural? Take the humble telegraph, for instance. To modern ears, a series of rapid clicks and taps doesn't seem spooky unless you're a character in a horror film. But for Victorians, this was cutting-edge sorcery. You could type a message in London and have it appear in Manchester in seconds. That kind of thing felt eerily similar to séance table knocking. It didn't help that Morse code was already full of rhythmic patterns that, to the less technologically savvy, felt suspiciously like a spectral codebook. Then there was the telephone, which at its debut felt downright otherworldly. Talking into a box and hearing someone's disembodied voice reply from far away, that sounded a lot like what mediums claim to do, except Bell's version came with a user manual and subscription fees instead of candles and Latin chanting. Early adopters marveled and recoiled in equal measure. Stories circulated of phones ringing in empty rooms, or voices coming through when no one had dialed. Did that mean the dead had figured out long distance? But perhaps no device gave more ghostly goosebumps than the phonograph, Edison's invention, which could play back human voices captured on wax cylinders, was a miracle of science and the start of many sleepless nights. You could record a message, leave the house, and have your voice speak back long after you'd gone. To some this was progress. To others, it was a sure sign the veil between worlds had officially gotten thinner and was now spinning at 33 revolutions per minute. Imagine a grieving widow sitting alone in a darkened parlor, playing back her late husband's voice for comfort. Now imagine the needle skipping, the voice slowing down into a deep demonic drawl, and the machine suddenly repeating the words, "I'm not gone, I'm not gone." Thanks to poor cylinder quality and unstable electricity, this was less horror fiction and more Tuesday evening. Naturally, all this eerie potential didn't go unnoticed by spiritualists. Mediums began using phonographs and recording devices during séances to capture ghost voices. Some even claimed the machines could pick up sounds inaudible to the human ear, essentially treating the tech like a spiritual hearing aid. One famous example involved a man named Frederick Bligh Bond, an archaeologist and spiritualist who believed his typewriter was guided by monks from the 13th century. Not through it, with it. He let the ghosts do the typing. The only thing more haunted than the typewriter was his logic. Meanwhile, skeptics and scientists were having their own awkward love affair with spooky tech. Members of the Society for Psychical Research began testing whether electromagnetic fields, telephone wires, and early recording devices could explain ghost sightings or capture actual phenomena. Spoiler alert, they found plenty of static, lots of awkward noise, and exactly 0 verified ghost messages. But the hope lingered like the smell of overcooked crumpets in a haunted tea shop. One of the more unintentionally hilarious effects of all this tech-based ghost paranoia was a rise in accidental hauntings. A telegraph wire humming from nearby moisture? Ghost. A phonograph clicking from temperature changes? Definitely a ghost. An old battery-operated doorbell ringing by itself? Time to call the local medium, or failing that, scream and run out of the house. Eventually, as people became more familiar with the technology, the fear subsided. Telephones stopped being channels to the beyond and became devices you ignored during dinner. Phonographs lost their mystery once everyone realized how often they broke. But for a brief, glorious moment, Victorians lived in a world where machines and ghosts coexisted in a creaky, clicky, and occasionally musical union. Of course, the next generation would find their own haunted gadgets. Radio, television, snow, and flickering electric lights all carried the same eerie, maybe it's haunted vibe. But no one did it with quite as much theatrical flair as the Victorians. who managed to turn every beep into a potential séance starter kit. By the time the 1920s rolled around, the ghosts were tired. They'd been summoned at dinner parties, called into drawing rooms, tapped on tables, spoken through trumpets, scribbled automatic letters, and even asked to pose for suspiciously blurry photographs. Frankly, the dead were overbooked, and the living were finally starting to get wise. The spiritualism craze that had gripped the Victorian world like a child with a Ouija board and no adult supervision began to fade for a few key reasons, none of which involved an actual drop in supernatural supply. Rather, people began realizing that the spirit hotline might have had more to do with clever stagecraft and less with spectral insight. One of the biggest nails in the séance coffin: fraud. Glorious, theatrical, borderline slapstick fraud. Once journalists, skeptics, and rival mediums started comparing notes, it turned out that a lot of spirit activity looked suspiciously like ventriloquism, sleight of hand, and the occasional hidden accomplice crawling under the table in a white sheet. It was less contacting the beyond and more contacting a man named Dave hiding in the cupboard. And then came Houdini. Yes, that Houdini, the escape artist, the man who could wriggle out of chains, tanks, straitjackets, and most impressively, a society absolutely riddled with nonsense. After the death of his beloved mother, Houdini desperately wanted to believe in spiritualism. He tried séance after séance, only to realize that every medium was just a magician without the honesty. So he switched sides. What followed was a one-man war on fakery. Houdini began attending séances in disguise and exposing fraudulent mediums mid-performance. His favorite move? Leaping up in the middle of a session and shouting fraud before explaining exactly how the ghostly effects were done. Table tipping, magnets, spirit writing, hidden ink, floating trumpet, a stick and a dark room. One can only imagine the atmosphere afterward. Equal parts gasps, awkward tea refills, and someone fainting near the drapes. But Houdini didn't stop there. He went on lecture tours. He published books. He even challenged mediums to replicate their effects under scientific conditions, and when they failed, which they did, often, he publicly roasted them with the flair of a stage illusionist turned myth-busting vigilante. The general public, weary after World War I, and faced with real loss and grief, began to follow his lead. The mood had shifted. Suddenly, people weren't comforted by table wraps and floating handkerchiefs. They wanted something sturdier. Therapy, philosophy, or just a good long cry with a bottle of gin. The desire to believe hadn't vanished, but the belief that ghosts had a detailed customer service hotline was beginning to fade. Scientific skepticism also sharpened its teeth. Psychical research, once flirtatious with the paranormal, began leaning toward the psychological. What once was considered proof of the afterlife started being labeled wishful thinking, subconscious suggestion, or just too many candles and not enough oxygen. Psychologists like Freud and Jung began exploring grief and the human mind in ways that made ghostly explanations seem a bit, well, lazy. By the 1930s, spirit photography was debunked. Séances were either exposed or regulated. Mediums were on trial, and Houdini, who tragically died in 1926, had made sure no fake ghost would rest in peace ever again. Eventually, spiritualism was no longer trendy, just nostalgic. It went from being fashionable high society entertainment to something your eccentric aunt still believed in, right between astrology and healing crystals. The spirit hotline, once ringing off the hook, now got nothing but static. Ghosts, perhaps mercifully, were finally left alone. And let's be honest, if the dead were real, they probably stopped answering out of sheer exhaustion. Being summoned every night by candlelight, only to be asked if Uncle Robert had found his missing socks, would wear down even the most patient phantom. The final twist? Today's technology has rebooted many of the same superstitions. Ghost hunting apps, EMF detectors, and seances have put a modern filter on Victorian fears. The hotline's still dead, but apparently it now has Wi-Fi. Welcome to the Ottoman Empire, where royal blood was both a blessing and a massive liability. You'd think being born a prince would mean sunshine, parades, and being fed grapes by people named Mustafa. But for young Ibrahim, the future sultan, it meant velvet walls, stifling silence, and the ever-present possibility that someone might strangle him in his sleep with a very expensive curtain tie. Because Ibrahim wasn't just born into royalty, he was born into the kafes, aka the gilded cage. The Ottoman Empire's idea of childcare crossed with a hostage situation. The word kafes literally means cage, and yes, it was as cozy as it sounds. Imagine a palace wing transformed into a high-security playpen where your only playmates were concubines, eunuchs, and your own anxiety. This was not the sort of place where kids were encouraged to grow up happy and healthy. This was a mental pressure cooker with silk drapes. The purpose of the cafes was to prevent royal brothers from killing each other in the great Ottoman pastime known as fratricide. Before the cafes system came into fashion, Ottoman succession was simple. If you became sultan, your first order of business was to kill all your brothers. Clean, efficient, extremely awkward at family reunions. But in the 17th century, a revolutionary idea took hold. What if, instead of murdering your brothers outright, you just locked them up indefinitely? That way they'd be alive technically, but too emotionally flattened to challenge your rule. And thus the kafs became standard royal policy. It was humane in the same way that putting a parrot in a gold-lined cage and expecting it to conduct international policy is humane. Ibrahim entered this bizarre limbo as a child, possibly as young as 2 or 3 years old. He wouldn't emerge again for decades, and when he did, the only thing more questionable than his grasp on governance was his grasp on reality. Ibrahim spent over 20 years in this royal lockdown, 2 decades. Think about that. That's the time it takes to raise a toddler into a full-grown adult, or, in Ibrahim's case, to raise a toddler into an adult-shaped bundle of unprocessed trauma. And this wasn't just a boring life, it was an emotionally radioactive one. Ibrahim had no access to education beyond what the court deemed safe, no real contact with the outside world, no friends, no rivals, just eunuchs delivering food, whispers of executions beyond the walls, and the constant tick-tick-tick of fate deciding whether he'd live or die based on someone else's mood. This is not the childhood environment that makes great leaders. It's the childhood that makes the guy at the dinner party who insists his teacup is plotting against him. By the time Ibrahim reached adulthood, it's no wonder people were already whispering that he might be unfit to rule. Reports from the time describe him as nervous, melancholic, and sensitive. That's polite 17th century diplomat speak, for this man should not be left alone with anything sharp. The one thing Ibrahim had in abundance was luxury without purpose. His every need was met, as long as his needs didn't include mental stimulation or freedom. He lived in rooms filled with plush cushions, embroidered silks and brocade curtains that probably cost more than a small village. His daily schedule involved lots of sitting, some pacing, and an unhealthy amount of listening for footsteps. He was also frequently told that his execution was imminent, because again, the Ottoman palace wasn't exactly a haven of emotional reassurance. At any moment, the guards could arrive and declare that the current sultan, his brother Murad IV, had decided to wrap up some family business. For all Ibrahim knew, every meal could be his last, and every rustle in the hall could be his final soundtrack. In other words, Ibrahim was raised like a cat in a thunderstorm with a trust fund. The saddest part is that no one expected much from him. His older brother Murad was a warrior king, famous for personally executing his officials with a sword. Compared to that, Ibrahim was considered soft, fragile, even disposable. He was just the backup, the spare prince in the royal junk drawer. But the thing about empires is, eventually everyone else dies, and suddenly the weird prince who talks to pillows is the only option left. So by the time the throne actually fell into Ibrahim's lap, he wasn't a confident, trained statesman. He was a man who had spent 2 decades sitting in silk pajamas, wondering if today would be the day someone strangled him. And spoiler alert, that upbringing was about to collide violently with unlimited power, a national treasury, and absolutely no adult supervision. Because when you raise a boy in a cage, don't be shocked when he comes out with feathers in his hair and pearls in his mouth. Imagine this. You're locked in a dimly lit palace room, haven't seen daylight in years. Your social circle consists of mute servants and your own intrusive thoughts, and suddenly someone bursts in and says, "Congratulations, you're in charge of the Ottoman Empire now." If your first reaction isn't hooray, but rather this is how they get me, then congratulations, you may be Sultan Ibrahim thine, because in 1640, that's exactly what happened. Ibrahim wasn't next in line to the throne so much as next in storage. His older brother Murad IV had ruled with a fist so iron it could have punched through granite. Murad was ruthless, violent, and oddly fond of executing people himself, which, depending on your perspective, is either hands-on leadership or HR's worst nightmare. Murad had made it very clear he didn't want anyone, including Ibrahim, threatening his rule. And when you've grown up knowing your brother personally beheaded disobedient officials just to stay sharp, literally, you don't exactly rush to update your resume. Murad's rule was one of military strength, religious conservatism, and brutal discipline. He banned alcohol, tobacco, and coffee, and then disguised himself to sneak through the streets at night, catching people in the act and personally delivering justice. That sounds cool until you realize justice often meant getting your head introduced to the pavement via Sultan-sponsored blunt force trauma. But then, and this is key, Murad passed away, and suddenly the empire needed a new sultan. Unfortunately, the shortlist was more of a shorter than usual list, because Murad had ensured there were no remaining brothers except one, Ibrahim, locked in the palace, half forgotten, and probably wondering if the next person through the door would be carrying flowers or a garrote. According to numerous chroniclers, when Murad died, no one told Ibrahim immediately. Why? Because Murad had a hobby of pretending he was dead just to test people's loyalty. Classic older brother move, but with more beheadings. So when the palace guards eventually knocked on Ibrahim's door and said, "Your Majesty, you're the new sultan," he refused to come out. He was convinced it was a trick, that Murad was still alive, and this was just another test, the Ottoman version of punked, only with execution instead of embarrassment. He reportedly cried, panicked, and shouted through the door that he knew this was just a trap to see if he'd show ambition, which, to be fair, was exactly how most of his other siblings had died. Only after several trusted palace officials, including his own mother, Kusem Sultan, more on her chaos later, swore up and down that Murad was really dead, did Ibrahim cautiously emerge. And even then, it's said he didn't celebrate. He reportedly collapsed in tears and murmured something along the lines of, "Please God, help me. I'm not fit to rule," which, as royal oaths go, isn't exactly Henry V at Agincourt, but at least he was honest. The empire wasn't looking for a strong leader. It was looking for anybody with the correct blood type and a pulse. Murad had no heirs, and the alternative was chaos, so they took a gamble on Ibrahim, who, to be fair, had never led an army, held court, or made a single political decision in his life, unless you count choosing which embroidered slippers to wear each morning. His experience in statecraft was limited to surviving the day without crying. His knowledge of governance came from whispers behind a silk screen. He had never even been outdoors without supervision. But hey, how hard could it be? The Ottomans had a massive, experienced bureaucracy and a well-oiled imperial machine. So in theory, Ibrahim didn't need to be brilliant. He just needed to sign things and stay calm. But spoiler, calm was not his strong suit. Not when the entire world now expected him to run one of the largest, richest, and most complex empires on Earth. It was like giving your cat the nuclear codes because it once meowed confidently. The court didn't celebrate either. In fact, the atmosphere in Topkapi Palace was said to be tense and uncertain because they all knew what the empire had just inherited, a sultan who hadn't mentally left the room he'd been raised in. Behind closed doors, whispers began. Would Kusem Sultan act as puppet master? Would the Grand Vizier take control? Would Ibrahim even show up to meetings or just issue decrees from under his pillow fort? For now, he was sultan. Technically, but the real question was, could he stay that way without unravelling completely? Because in the Ottoman Empire, The throne had no seatbelts, no manual, and no therapist, and the man now sitting on it had just crawled out of a cage, not as a lion, but as a very anxious silk-wrapped kitten with trust issues and a looming empire to run. So there he was, freshly dragged from the velvet-lined trauma chamber of his youth and plopped onto the most powerful throne in the Muslim world, Sultan Ibrahim, supreme ruler of an empire that stretched from Budapest to Baghdad, commander of armies, shadow of God on earth, and he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. It became apparent very quickly that while Ibrahim had technically ascended to the throne, the job title came without a manual, training, or, let's be honest, a functioning grasp on reality. The early weeks of his reign were spent in a sort of dazed dawdle, where other sultans might stride confidently into a throne room and start firing off decrees about taxes or treaties. Ibrahim mostly stood there looking like someone who'd just been asked to operate a catapult with no prior warning. The first problem was that Ibrahim had no interest in actually ruling. He wasn't curious about policies. He didn't ask about the economy. He showed no desire to lead armies or inspect provinces. What he was interested in were dreams, not visions of empire or ambition, literal dreams. He'd wake up and declare something like, "Last night I dreamed of fish. All taxes on seafood shall now be doubled," and the court would just nod, because saying no to the Sultan was still a very efficient way to get promoted to headless civilian. This meant that for much of his reign, real decision-making fell to his Grand Viziers, the Ottoman equivalent of overworked executive assistants who didn't sign up for this level of nonsense. These poor men weren't just expected to run the empire, they had to run it around the whims of a man who once ordered government buildings rearranged because he didn't like the energy in a certain hallway. If modern HR departments existed back then, they would have staged a full coup by Tuesday. The court quickly realized that Ibrahim could not be managed through reason, logic, or anything even resembling a plan. He could only be managed through managing his moods. When he was in a good mood, the empire drifted peacefully along, held together by experienced administrators, an indifferent army, and the fact that half of Europe was too busy fighting itself to take advantage. But when Ibrahim got bored, paranoid, or just a little too excited by cloud shapes, things got unpredictable. One of his most infamous habits was making policy decisions based on omens, good omens, bad omens, bird calls, funny smells. It didn't matter. If something gave him a vibe, it might become law. On more than one occasion, he delayed important council meetings because he spotted a cloud shaped like a dagger. At one point, he became convinced that a white seagull who kept landing on the palace roof was his reincarnated grandfather. This led to a brief period where grain shipments were delayed across Anatolia because the Sultan was busy feeding breadcrumbs to a bird and whispering state secrets at it. But even his connection to the divine pigeon network wasn't enough to mask the fact that the empire was starting to crack under the weight of his erratic behavior. He began handing out titles to complete nobodies, many of whom were court favorites, flatterers, or people who happened to amuse him in the moment. One man was made a high-ranking official after performing an interpretive dance about starfish. Another was appointed to a provincial governorship for telling a joke about soup that Ibrahim liked so much he made everyone in the room clap. Meanwhile, the Grand Viziers were burning out faster than torches in a wind tunnel. They were expected to uphold centuries of tradition, manage imperial finances, maintain military operations, and also explain to foreign diplomats why the Sultan had suddenly issued a ban on beards longer than 2 fists in length because it upset the palace cats. Diplomacy was hard enough in the 17th century. It was harder when your boss was treating foreign emissaries to puppet shows using gold-encrusted slippers. Ibrahim's spending habits also began to spiral. Money flowed like sherbet at a summer festival. Fortunes were dumped into silk, brocade, perfumes, and renovations that mostly involved moving things from one side of the room to the other. One day he'd be convinced that a new color of carpet would bring prosperity. The next, he'd fund the construction of an entire fountain system because he liked the sound of trickling water while he napped. Budgets were ignored. Accountants cried. Somewhere, a camel probably developed stress-induced ulcers from hauling crates of imported incense across the empire. The empire, for a time, survived this surreal stage of leadership, mostly out of sheer inertia. The Ottoman machine was big, well-oiled, and often operated in spite of its leadership rather than because of it. But anyone with sense could see it was teetering, like a once mighty ship captained by a man who thought the compass was whispering to him. And while the bureaucrats kept things afloat, everyone knew that sooner or later the waves of Ibrahim's impulses were going to swamp the deck, because ruling the Ottoman Empire required strength, wisdom, and diplomacy. Ibrahim, on the other hand, had vibes, pillows, and a suspicious relationship with birds. If the phrase retail therapy had an Ottoman translation, Sultan Ibrahim would have invented it, embroidered it on a 24-karat gold handkerchief, and then stuffed it into one of his 14,000 silk shirts. Yes, that number is real. Sultan Ibrahim I, ruler of one of the most powerful empires on earth, collected garments the way some people collect stamps, only with slightly more satin and screaming tailors. Let's put this into perspective. 14,000 garments. That's a different outfit every day for nearly 40 years. Or, if you're more of a wardrobe changer, about 38 outfit changes per day for a whole year. And we're not talking about a drawer full of identical t-shirts. These were hand-stitched, imported, embroidered, opulent pieces, often made from fine silk, brocade, fur, and fabric that looked like it had a better diet than half the empire. Ibrahim's wardrobe was so excessive that palace records note entire rooms converted into dressing chambers and storage halls. His servants, and oh pity the poor palace servants, were tasked with cataloguing, organizing, and maintaining a textile mountain that probably had its own microclimate. And unlike your average modern shopaholic, Ibrahim wasn't hiding his purchases in the back of a closet and pretending they were on sale. No, he flaunted his obsession, often changing clothes multiple times a day just to match his mood or the color of a passing cloud. The Sultan's fashion demands became so legendary that foreign ambassadors sent reports back to Europe describing the Ottoman court as a moving fabric bazaar, with the Sultan appearing daily like a man being chased by Vogue magazine itself. One day he'd be in ermine-lined robes, the next in gold-threaded kaftans that shimmered like a disco ball under candlelight. If tailors had a patron saint, Ibrahim would have built them a mosque. The palace tailors were, by necessity, some of the hardest working men in Istanbul. Their workdays began early and ended when their fingers cramped into permanent thimbles. Imagine having to sew luxury garments for a man who judged clothing the way a sommelier judges wine, with dramatic flair, confusing metaphors, and the occasional demand to start over because the velvet felt like betrayal. It said he once rejected a robe because it didn't sing with warmth. Whatever that means, but why this textile obsession? Part of it might stem from the intense sensory deprivation of his earlier years, having spent much of his life in the cafes, denied sunlight, social interaction, and pretty much anything except anxiety and fruit bowls. Ibrahim emerged into power like a man who had just discovered color. Silk was more than a fabric. It was an emotional experience. Dressing in fine garments wasn't just vanity. It was therapy, identity, and maybe even a substitute for human connection. Who needs loyal friends when you've got a fur-lined vest that understands you? His indulgences also served as a sort of state-sponsored theatre. The sheer extravagance of his attire sent a message. The Ottoman Empire was not to be outdressed. The wealth of the court was on display every time Ibrahim twirled into a room looking like the world's richest sofa. Diplomats took notes, subjects gawked, and somewhere in the corner a tailor wept quietly into a pile of unused buttons. But this wasn't without cost, literally. The empire's treasury strained under the weight of his haberdashery habits. While wars were being waged and infrastructure crumbled, money was being funneled into fabric imports, dyes, and custom sewing commissions. Silk shipments from Persia and India spiked, tailor guilds flourished, and the laundry bill? Don't ask. Let's just say no one has ever worn that much velvet and walked away fiscally responsible. Despite the absurdity, Ibrahim's fashion fixation reveals deeper truths about the man and his reign. It's a window into how disconnected he was from reality, how obsessed he became with luxury as a way to assert control, and how often his reign blurred the line between opulence and oblivion. Historians today still debate whether he was mad, eccentric, or just really into seasonal fabrics. Perhaps it was all three. And in the end, Ibrahim's fashion legacy outlived him. His garments were preserved in palace archives. His style echoed in court fashions long after his downfall. Some of his robes still survive today, locked behind museum glass, because even centuries later people can't stop staring and asking, who on earth needed this many shirts? The answer, of course, is Sultan Ibrahim. The man who dressed like every day was his coronation and every robe was a revolution. If there was one thing Sultan Ibrahim loved more than silk, power, or even reality itself, it was pearls. Not just a fondness, not a casual appreciation like your grandmother's favorite necklace. No, this was a full-blown, all-consuming, wallet-emptying, court-alarming obsession. If pearls were a person, Ibrahim would have married them, twice, and then given them a title. To Ibrahim, pearls weren't merely shiny sea beads, they were symbols of divine favor, imperial glory, and apparently a great way to decorate literally everything. Picture a man who wakes up in a pearl-inlaid bed, dresses in pearl-encrusted robes, walks across pearl-studded carpets, and then leans on a staff covered in, you guessed it, pearls. It's not just overkill, it's a lifestyle. A shimmering, impractical, seafaring lifestyle. Now you may be wondering, how did one of the most powerful men in the world turn into a mollusk-obsessed magpie? Let's dive in. Ibrahim's fixation with pearls was partly aesthetic, partly symbolic, and mostly just Ibrahim being Ibrahim. In the Ottoman Empire, pearls were traditionally a sign of wealth and status, often used by the elite to dazzle and one-up each other like 17th century rappers. But Ibrahim didn't stop at tasteful adornment. He plunged headfirst into an all-out pearl crusade. We're talking throne rooms that looked like Poseidon's jewelry box exploded. We're talking royal attendants dripping in pearls like underdressed chandeliers. Even the palace doors got blinged out. Legend has it one poor door looked so fabulous that guests bowed to it by accident. He had furniture inlaid with pearls, curtains sewn with them, ceremonial weapons lined with pearly mosaics. Even horse saddles weren't safe from the sparkle. If it had a surface, Ibrahim tried to bedazzle it. Historians describe one particularly extravagant commission, a pearl-studded cradle. Now, was it for a child, a cat, a favorite melon? Who knows? With Ibrahim, guessing was part of the charm. But the obsession didn't stop at decorating the palace. No, that would be rational. Ibrahim began issuing decrees that sent the empire's merchants into a pearl panic. He ordered entire marketplaces swept clean of pearls. If pearls existed within reach, they were confiscated, redirected, and funneled straight into the palace. Pearls were no longer trade goods, they were tribute to a man who may or may not have tried to talk to them. Some reports suggest Ibrahim even commissioned divers to go pearl hunting off the coasts of Arabia and India, insisting that the empire secure the biggest and most beautiful pearls ever found. It didn't matter if it cost a fortune, bankrupted provinces, or sent swimmers to their watery doom. If it didn't sparkle, it wasn't worth his time. The treasury officials, meanwhile, were almost certainly weeping into ledgers, whispering, "Why not potatoes? Potatoes are cheap." To put things in perspective, while Europe was grappling with the 30 Years' War, and the Ottomans were theoretically managing an empire that spanned 3 continents, their ruler was holding up pearls to the sunlight and rating them like a TikTok beauty influencer. Government meetings, meh, pearl polishing, absolutely. There's even a tale that Ibrahim once offered pearls as rewards to courtiers who entertained him well. Dancing monkey, pearl necklace, good joke, pearl ring, didn't annoy him today, bucket of pearls. At this point, the court wasn't functioning so much as performing a never-ending talent show for a man who shopped like a bored dragon. Of course, his obsession came with consequences. The relentless demand drove up pearl prices and distorted regional markets. Traders who once dealt in spices, textiles, and art were now hoarding and smuggling pearls, hoping to hit the jackpot with a single sale. Black markets sprang up, and entire local economies shifted to accommodate the Sultan's sea-borne whims. But there was one final flourish to this pearly fever dream. Ibrahim reportedly believed that pearls held mystical properties. Some accounts suggest he thought they could ward off illness or improve vitality. Did he grind them into powder and drink them? Possibly. Would it surprise us if he tried to commune with them in candlelit ceremonies while wearing a matching robe and turban set? Not even slightly. In the end, Ibrahim's pearl obsession became a metaphor for his rule. Beautiful, baffling, ruinously expensive, and absolutely bonkers. He didn't just love pearls, he lived them. Every glint was a declaration of his imperial grandeur, every strand a shrug at fiscal responsibility. And when you rule like a man in love with mollusks, history tends to remember you not as a warrior or a visionary, but as that one sultan who made the ocean's jewelry his entire personality. If Sultan Ibrahim's reign had a slogan, it would be, "Looks good, sounds insane, burns everything down." Because by the time we reach the later years of his rule, the Ottoman Empire was less of a finely tuned machine and more of a gilded wagon barreling downhill, on fire, being steered by a man choosing advisors based on who could flatter his hat the most. While Ibrahim spun himself in circles of silk and pearls, the rest of the empire was quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, unravelling. Let's begin with the generous handouts. Sultan Ibrahim, in his boundless enthusiasm for rewarding loyalty, or what he perceived as loyalty, which sometimes looked suspiciously like whoever agreed with him the loudest, began handing out titles and estates like they were commemorative mugs at a failing museum gift shop. Pashas, bees, viziers, everyone got a promotion, want a governorship, compliment the Sultan's robe, fancy a palace, bring him a particularly shiny oyster. The result? An elite class bloated with unqualified sycophants and a bureaucracy that had more titles than actual job descriptions. And you better believe those newly minted nobles weren't about to pay their own way. Someone had to foot the bill. Enter the tax hikes. The empire, ever the patient mule, was being squeezed for every coin it had. And what was all this money for? Military reform? Infrastructure? Schools? Of course not. It went straight into the silk budget, because heaven forbid the Sultan's slippers weren't lined with imported velvet. Taxes rose sharply on everything from grain to soap, and the general populace, farmers, merchants, craftspeople, were left wondering why their children were starving while the Sultan's tulip-embroidered pants needed a second wardrobe. It didn't take long for unrest to fester. The Janissaries, the once elite Ottoman military corps, had historically been powerful, disciplined, and not exactly known for their patience. They weren't thrilled with Ibrahim's leadership style, which could generously be described as erratic, and less generously as utterly deranged. When salaries were delayed, supplies were mismanaged, and promotions were handed to glorified yes-men, the Janissaries did what they always eventually did. They got very loud, very angry, and very dangerous. The army began to disintegrate in both morale and structure. Soldiers were sent to battle without proper planning or funding, and campaigns failed spectacularly. Provinces were left to fend for themselves, while rebellions and regional uprisings went unanswered, or were crushed with such brute force that entire towns were left scarred. But none of this seemed to trouble the man at the top, who remained in his palace arranging pearls in aesthetically pleasing spirals and ordering tailors to match his shirts to his mood. And while internal issues were bad enough, the foreign policy of Ibrahim's reign could be summed up as, "Don't ask," wars were either bungled into or outright ignored. Territories that once trembled at the might of the Ottomans began nibbling at its borders. Neighbouring states looked at Istanbul and saw an empire drunk on luxury and led by a man who once tried to declare war on the sea for being too loud. Meanwhile, trade collapsed. With markets distorted by extravagant demands from the palace, especially the endless hoarding of pearls, silks, and other luxuries, prices skyrocketed, goods became unaffordable, black markets thrived, and merchants who once made fortunes in Istanbul began shifting their business elsewhere. Even seasoned Ottoman traders found it difficult to explain to foreign buyers why a shipment of rice had been rerouted so the Sultan could inspect it for potential spiritual resonance. Inside the capital, discontent simmered. Riots broke out sporadically, often triggered by food shortages or overtaxation. The common people had long tolerated eccentric rulers. Ottoman history is not short on colourful sultans, but Ibrahim took the cake, frosted it with crushed pearls, and fed it to his favourite concubine's parrot. Eventually, the palace gates started to feel less like the doors to power and more like the walls of a slowly closing trap. What's remarkable about this phase of the reign is how truly disconnected the Sultan became from the functioning of his empire. His ministers ran things with minimal direction, often writing policies and hoping he wouldn't notice unless they interfered with his tailoring schedule. Governing by autopilot wasn't new in large empires, but this wasn't autopilot. This was a toddler flying a jetliner while the pilot rearranged his hat collection. And yet to outsiders peeking in from a distance, the Ottomans still appeared formidable. The architecture remained grand, the wealth of centuries still glittered, and the name of the empire carried weight. But like a crumbling mansion with a fresh coat of paint, it was becoming harder to hide the cracks. And at the centre of it all sat a man more concerned with what colour sash to wear on Tuesday than whether the treasury still had anything in it besides lint and receipts from pearl merchants. So, while the empire was metaphorically ablaze, Ibrahim's answer was not reform or retreat or reflection, it was to import more silk, because if you're going to captain a sinking ship, you might as well look fabulous doing it. In the grand Ottoman tradition of letting things simmer until the whole empire boils over, Sultan Ibrahim's reign finally reached its logical and utterly dramatic conclusion. It's hard to say what was more shocking, the fact that he lasted 8 years in power, or that it took that long for literally everyone around him to collectively say, "All right, that's enough of that." By 1648, the empire was teetering on the edge of ruin, not the fun, flamboyant kind of ruin with wine fountains and toga parties. No, this was the "why is the army sharpening their swords in our direction" kind of ruin. The economy was bleeding silver like a hemophiliac with a grudge. The provinces were restless, and the janissaries, those famously loyal soldiers who were absolutely not in the mood to be underpaid, had begun practicing their most menacing glares. All signs pointed to doom, and unfortunately for Ibrahim, omens don't respond to pearl-encrusted bribes. His behaviour hadn't exactly calmed down with age. If anything, it was as if the Sultan had hit a new stride in the race against rational governance. He was rumoured to have dismissed ministers for sneezing too loudly, held long conversations with mirrors, and accused his courtiers of plotting against him if they wore colours he didn't like. One story suggests he had his entire harem thrown into the Bosphorus for immorality. Whether it was jealousy, paranoia, or just an intense misunderstanding of bath time remains unclear. The clergy, usually the sort of group who preferred to mutter theological objections quietly into their tea, began speaking out. When even the religious scholars are saying this guy might not be God's favourite, you know things are headed south. Add to this the janissaries, those elite warriors who had once marched proudly under the Sultan's banner, now standing around with arms crossed and eyebrows raised, and you've got the perfect recipe for regime change. But here's the poetic twist. Ibrahim, lover of silks, spender of fortunes, owner of garments so numerous they may have had diplomatic representation. He met his end by strangulation with a silk cord. Yes, in the Ottoman Empire, this was the classy way to go. No guillotines or rough-hewn axes for royalty. Execution by silk was a nod to elegance in death, because apparently you can still keep up appearances while being removed from the living. It all began with his mother. Yes, the same Kozum Sultan, who had once ensured he was released from the cage to take the throne. When even your own mum is side-eyeing your reign and calling emergency political meetings, you know you've messed up in a uniquely royal way. She worked with the janissaries and the religious elite to organize his deposition. On August 8, 1648, the decision was made official. Ibrahim was formally dethroned. Though given his apparent detachment from reality, It's unclear whether he thought this was a vacation, a prank, or a bad dream involving slightly fewer shirts than usual. They moved him to the same gilded cage he'd once called home, and within days the order was given. Strangled by the Bostanci imperial executioners who specialized in the no-blood, no-problem school of dispatching the sultan, exited life in the most fashionably tragic way imaginable. He was 32 years old, having spent more than a quarter of his life as ruler, and nearly all of it as a walking argument for mental health reform, a conversation no one in the 17th century was quite ready to have. What followed was a trail of economic recovery efforts, political scrambling, and historians trying to figure out whether Ibrahim was truly mad or just tragically ill-equipped for a job that required more than silk appreciation and pearl poetry. His successor Mehmed IV was just a child, meaning the adults were finally put back in charge, although adult in Ottoman politics often just meant equally dangerous but better dressed. And yet Ibrahim's legacy isn't just the madness, it's the sheer spectacle of his reign. Historians still argue over the causes of his behavior, whether it was the cage, inherited instability, or a potent cocktail of bad advice and worse impulse control. But what's not up for debate is this. His rule stands as one of the most bizarre, lavish, and unintentionally comedic chapters in Ottoman history. Because at the end of the day, Sultan Ibrahim wasn't a villain in the traditional sense. He didn't seek to conquer Europe, destroy institutions, or crush dissent with a steel fist. He just wanted to wear absurdly expensive outfits, be surrounded by pearls, and rule an empire like it was a misunderstood art installation. And for that, he got a footnote in history and a silk cord around the neck. Some people go out with a bang. Ibrahim, ever on brand, went out with a soft, luxurious whisper. There are two types of concrete in the world, the kind that sulks into cracks, flakes under pressure, and starts crumbling at the first whiff of moisture. And then there's Roman concrete, which laughs in the face of centuries, tsunamis, barbarian invasions, and pigeons. While modern buildings reach their expiration dates faster than a carton of milk in the sun, Roman structures built over 2,000 years ago are still flexing their ancient biceps with barely a crack. This isn't just durability, it's architectural witchcraft. So how is it that modern concrete, supposedly the evolved industrial age version of this material, begins to fall apart in just a few decades, while the Romans were mixing something that practically made itself stronger with time? If modern concrete were a social media influencer, Roman concrete would be that unbothered grandparent who still climbs mountains at 90 and refuses to explain how. To understand why Roman concrete is the Beyoncé of building materials, we have to first grasp just how underwhelming modern concrete can be. It's made by combining cement, usually Portland cement, sand, gravel, and water. It sets fast, it's cheap, and it works for a while. But it's also moody, brittle, and frankly, a bit of a diva. Expose it to salt, freeze-thaw cycles, moisture, or steel corrosion, and it starts to crack like your phone screen after one drop. Its average lifespan, around 50 to 100 years, assuming it's not being used as a highway bridge, in which case better cut that number in half. Now contrast that with the Roman approach. The Romans didn't just build buildings, they built legacies, temples, bathhouses, aqueducts, harbours, all using a concrete so resilient that many of their creations are still structurally sound today. And we're not talking about a few ruins and a suspiciously lucky wall. We're talking entire seaports still standing underwater, domes that have never collapsed, roads that can still handle foot traffic. Meanwhile, some modern airports have had to resurface their runways before the ink dried on the blueprints. There's a quiet confidence in Roman concrete. It doesn't shout, it doesn't shimmer, and it doesn't come in ready-mix trucks. It just lasts. It's the ancient equivalent of the strong, silent type, the kind of concrete that watches your skyscraper with rebar skeletons corrode into a tragic retirement and thinks, amateurs. But what makes this so astonishing is that Roman builders didn't have access to modern chemistry, structural testing equipment, or even the scientific method as we know it. They didn't run experiments in labs, they ran empires. And their material of choice was a kind of proto-concrete that they knew, through centuries of observation and trial, would become stronger over time. It wasn't just construction, it was philosophy. Build not for now, but for 1,000 years from now. Perhaps the most poetic thing about Roman concrete is that it was never intended to be temporary. In the Roman worldview, permanence was power. Concrete wasn't a tool, it was a symbol. The Roman state was eternal, so why wouldn't its walls be? Their entire urban identity was cast in stone and lime and ash, but we'll save that recipe for later. When you walked into a Roman forum or passed under a triumphal arch, you weren't just stepping into a public space, you were stepping into a message carved in chemical certainty. We were here, and we're not going anywhere. Today, the irony is almost painful. Our modern world, with all its technology and knowledge, still hasn't cracked the Roman concrete code. And every year, governments around the globe pour billions into fixing roads, patching dams, or shoring up bridges, all made of a material that somehow forgot how to age gracefully. It's like reinventing the wheel and forgetting how to make it round. So we return, bewildered, to the ruins of antiquity, staring up at the Pantheon, or down into an ancient harbour wall, wondering how this ancient civilization built things that didn't just survive time but defied it. Roman concrete wasn't just an invention, it was a slow-cooked miracle, a recipe forged in volcanic dust and imperial ambition, and it's still outlasting us in the most smug, stoic way possible. Modern buildings file for retirement after 70. Roman ones, they're still showing off their abs at 2000, sun-kissed and smug, as if to say, call me when your parking garage turns into a world wonder. Roman concrete, or opus caementitium if you're feeling fancy and a little too confident in your Latin, wasn't your average cement mix. This wasn't a toss it in the mixer, pray for the best kind of recipe. No, the Romans were kitchen chemists with a taste for eternal durability, and their secret sauce came with a volcanic twist. If you've ever looked at the crumbling state of your driveway and wondered why a civilization with no internet figured out better concrete than we have now, welcome to the magical ingredients list that built an empire. Let's start with the star of the show, volcanic ash, known as pozzolana, named after the town of Pozzuoli near Naples. This magical grey powder had a unique chemical structure that reacted beautifully with lime and water. Not beautifully like, oh wow, what a nice foamy mix, but beautifully as in I will become rock solid and outlive your entire civilization. While modern cement relies on Portland cement, a kind of industrial cement known for setting fast and crumbling slightly faster, Roman concrete was the slow-cooking stew of building materials. It didn't just set, it matured. It developed strength over time, like a fine wine or a gladiator with a grudge. Pozzolana was no ordinary ash. It was born from fire and fury, literally. When Mount Vesuvius and other volcanoes in the region exploded with molten rage, they left behind deposits of silicate-rich ash packed with reactive compounds. The Romans, with their practical genius and casual disregard for safety regulations, scooped it up and figured out that when you mix it with slaked lime, calcium hydroxide and water, it formed a calcium-aluminum silicate hydrate matrix. Yes, it sounds like something you'd learn in chemistry class right before switching majors, but that matrix is the reason Roman harbors, piers and temples are still standing. Now here's where it gets even more impressive. They added seawater, not out of laziness, but because they noticed something incredible. Over time, the chemical reactions with seawater actually strengthened the concrete. While modern cement reacts to seawater like a sensitive aristocrat tossed into a mud puddle, crumbling, whining, and falling apart, Roman concrete just shrugged, hardened, and kept going. In fact, the seawater triggered a rare phenomenon. Crystals of aluminous tobamite started forming. These crystals, the microscopic bodybuilders of the mineral world, actually reinforced the structure over time. So yes, Roman concrete literally self-healed. Imagine if your house fixed its own cracks instead of giving you passive-aggressive water stains. The last ingredient in the mix? Rubble, stones, tiles, broken pottery, basically anything lying around. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like the Romans were just sweeping their construction trash into the mix. But this wasn't a junk pile, it was strategic. The rubble acted as aggregate, like the gravel in today's concrete, but with much more personality and arguably archaeological value. Some mixtures even included chunks of brick and recycled masonry, which not only reduced weight but improved strength. It's the kind of sustainable building method that would make today's eco-conscious architects cry into their blueprints. Compare this to modern Portland cement, a quick-set mix of limestone and clay fired in kilns at thousands of degrees. It's cheap, it's fast, and it lasts about as long as a TikTok trend. Modern concrete's problem is its rigidity. It doesn't adapt, it doesn't respond to environmental changes, and it absolutely cannot deal with salt water. The Romans, by contrast, built structures that interacted with their surroundings like they were in a long-term relationship, one that involved a little chemistry, a lot of volcanic ash, and a commitment to lasting longer than the people who built them. What's especially galling is that Roman engineers didn't just stumble upon this recipe, they refined it over time, experimenting with regional ash types, different ratios, and varying techniques depending on the project. Seaside baths, add more pozzolana, giant dome, use lighter pumice aggregate. It wasn't one size fits all, it was tailored, like the Armani suit of construction materials. They understood their medium deeply, even if they never wrote it all down in one convenient place. Thanks a lot, Vitruvius. And now, nearly 2,000 years later, our best minds are still trying to decode the exact formula. Scientists have analyzed core samples from Roman breakwaters submerged in the Mediterranean. They've run the compositions through every machine short of a particle collider. And still, we can't quite replicate it. We get close. But the original? That's still a masterpiece locked in history, like a lost recipe for immortality scribbled in volcanic dust. So next time you walk by a crumbling sidewalk or see scaffolding hugging a building younger than your grandma, remember, the Romans would be deeply, deeply disappointed. They built things to last by throwing ash, lime, seawater and debris together and somehow conjuring up a miracle. And if that isn't awe-inspiring, or just slightly annoying, you probably work in modern construction. If you've ever left metal near seawater for more than 5 minutes, you know the ocean is a ruthless, rust-loving, structure-shaming force of nature. Ships rot, steel skeletons of piers decay. Even modern concrete, armed with all our brilliant engineering, eventually gives up size and dissolves into soggy regret. But then enter Roman concrete. Not only does it shrug off 2,000 years of saltwater abuse, it seems to thrive in it. Roman harbour structures are still standing proudly in coastal ruins from Italy to Israel, while modern piers get replaced more often than light bulbs. So how did ancient engineers pull off this marine magic trick, and why are today's scientists still scratching their heads? Let's start at the coastline, where Roman ingenuity meets Poseidon's worst mood swings. The ancient Romans had a knack for civil engineering that bordered on divine. They built harbours, yes, entire wave-battered, sea-sprayed port complexes out of a special version of their now famous concrete. The result? Places like Portus, Rome's great imperial harbour, Cosa, a coastal colony, and countless other maritime installations remain largely intact, while many modern equivalents would struggle to survive a century without maintenance crews and concrete patch kits. Here's the plot twist. The salt water didn't weaken the concrete, it made it stronger. That's right, Roman marine concrete didn't just resist the ocean's rage. It essentially went to the gym every time the tide came in. The secret lies not in a magical Roman spell, but in the ancient recipe's surprising chemistry, especially when it came to how it interacted with seawater. You see, most modern concrete starts to break down when exposed to salt. The chloride ions attack the steel rebar inside, corroding it and causing the surrounding concrete to crack. Roman concrete didn't rely on steel rebar for one, but even more impressively, its mix wasn't chemically static. The blend of volcanic ash, lime, quicklime or slaked lime, and seawater produced a reaction that, instead of corroding the structure, formed new minerals, most notably a rare type called aluminum tobermorite. Sounds like a wizard's spell, but it's real science. Aluminum tobermorite is a crystalline mineral that forms over time inside the concrete. In the Roman version, this process happens when seawater seeps in and reacts with the volcanic ash. Instead of breaking the material down, the water helps heal it, forming these needle-like crystals that actually strengthen the structure from the inside out. Imagine if every time you got rained on, your bones got stronger. That's what's happening here. It's anti-aging for architecture. This mineral growth doesn't happen in modern concrete, which is made primarily from Portland cement, a faster setting, less reactive mix that prioritizes speed and uniformity over long-term durability. Roman builders, by contrast, played the long game. Their concrete didn't set instantly. It matured, it evolved, like a fine wine made of stone. Scientists have known about the durability of Roman concrete for ages, but only recently have they been able to explain why it performs so absurdly well underwater. Researchers at places like the University of Utah and Berkeley have been analyzing ancient samples using scanning electron microscopes, X-ray diffraction, and other instruments that probably look like they belong in a spaceship. What they've found continues to impress. Complex interlocking crystals, chemically evolving bonds, and long-term mineral growth. Essentially self-improving material that's better at holding its form in salt water than anything we mass-produce today. One of the most astonishing features, these structures weren't made with access to modern equipment. There were no computer simulations, no stress testing laboratories, no ISO-certified quality assurance programs. The Romans were mixing this stuff with hand tools, carts, and probably some guy yelling about Jupiter every 10 minutes. And yet they created a building material that laughs in the face of erosion. It's no wonder modern engineers are green with envy. There are even efforts underway to reverse engineer the ancient recipe, especially for use in underwater infrastructure like breakwaters, bridges, and seawalls. If we could bottle this ancient brilliance, we might just build a world where underwater structures don't age like dairy in the sun. The problem? The exact ratios and methods are still up for debate, and while some of the chemical reactions are replicable, the specific volcanic ash the Romans used came from very particular sources, like the Bay of Naples. You can't just grab any old pile of ash and hope for concrete miracles. In short, Roman marine concrete is the kind of overachieving material that makes modern concrete look like it's made of wet cardboard, and all without fancy degrees, titanium reinforcements or epoxy. Just a bucket of ash, some lime, and a sea that probably assumed it would win. So next time you're walking down a cracked and crumbling pier, just remember, 2,000 years ago the Romans were building underwater monuments that could outlive empires, and they did it in sandals. Imagine building a structure that lasts longer than most civilizations without blueprints, lab analysis, or even a standard unit of measurement. No calculators, no digital scales, no how-to videos. Just a man in a tunic, a pile of ash, and the inexplicable confidence of someone who's figured out the universe through trial and error. That's the genius and chaos behind Roman concrete. Modern engineers scratch their heads wondering how these toga-clad masons pulled it off. The Romans weren't exactly scribbling lab notes or organizing ingredient lists into tidy spreadsheets. Their approach to construction was less follow the formula, and more ask the guy who's done this for 30 years and has seen some things. Welcome to the Roman school of vibes-based engineering. While we often think of Roman engineering as a hyper-precise science, aqueducts, roads, arches, their mastery of concrete came not from scientific documentation, but generational wisdom. Think of it as a recipe your great-grandmother handed down, measured not in cups or grams, but in a handful of this, a pinch of that, and until it feels right. Instead of standardized measurements, Roman builders used intuition, sight, touch, and the all-important skill of eyeballing. Want to know if the mix was good? Look at how it stuck to your hand. Smell the lime. Feel the heat of the chemical reaction. If the mixture steamed like an angry tea kettle, you were probably on the right track. Was it messy? Absolutely. But was it effective? Unquestionably. No manuals, just masters. Unlike today's engineers with their formal degrees and license certificates, Roman construction relied on guilds, associations of skilled artisans who passed down knowledge the old-fashioned way: apprentice, observe, imitate, and eventually surpass. These guilds weren't just casual clubs where masons discussed stone over wine. They were tight-knit, often secretive communities of builders who knew the craft like the back of their dusty hands. A young apprentice might start by hauling materials or stirring mortar, gradually moving up the ranks until they could mix the magical blend of lime, ash, and rubble without collapsing a temple. Their education was oral, tactile, and based on memory. If someone asked how much pozzolana to use in a harbour wall, the answer was probably something like, "Enough to make the wall not fall into the sea. Use your head, Lucius." It was a mentorship system with high stakes. Mix the wrong ratio, and instead of a glorious Roman bathhouse, you'd get an accidental foot bath with crumbling walls. The role of regional wisdom. Another trick up the Roman concrete sleeve: regional customization. Roman builders weren't blindly mixing whatever was nearby. They intimately understood the quirks of their local materials. Builders in Campania, for example, knew their volcanic ash from Mount Vesuvius was basically the gold standard for durability. Meanwhile, builders further north or east might adjust the formula to compensate for weaker pozzolanic properties. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all recipe, it was tailored engineering. They didn't just build with the earth, they built according to it. This practical adaptability made Roman concrete not just strong but smart. It's like if every town had its own version of sourdough starter, except instead of tangy bread, you got structures that still stand 2 millennia later. Concrete by committee? Never heard of it. One of the reasons Roman concrete worked so well is that decision-making wasn't buried in bureaucratic sludge. There were no zoning boards arguing about which brand of volcanic ash to use. No procurement meetings wondering whether to import lime from 20 miles farther away to save a few denarii. The master builder made the call, quickly, on site, based on instinct. You trusted his grey hairs and ash-streaked hands because he wasn't working from a theory, he was working from a career of watching concrete behave. And perhaps most importantly, Roman builders didn't overthink it. Modern engineers may try to replicate every mineral down to the atomic structure, but sometimes the answer lies not in chemistry, but in generational craftsmanship, in the kind of knowledge you just feel. Modern lesson: trust the process and the guy named Gaius. Today's researchers still marvel at Roman concrete, but one reason we struggle to reproduce it may be that we're looking for the wrong kind of instructions. We want hard science. They had hard experience, and sometimes that's even harder to replicate. So next time you see the Pantheon's dome or the seawall at Portus, remember it wasn't built by a robot with precise sensors. It was built by a man who had no measuring cup, but did have calloused hands, a lifetime of apprenticeship, and a suspiciously smug look that said, "Yeah, I nailed it." No blueprints, just vibes and volcanic ash. In the Roman Empire, architectural design wasn't just about building stuff. It was about building a legacy, preferably one that would still be standing when the average empire had gone the way of the dodo. And nothing screamed, "We're better than you," quite like a 142-foot concrete dome that's still looking smug 2,000 years later. The Romans didn't just use concrete because it was sturdy, though that certainly helped when barbarians came knocking. They used it as imperial propaganda, a sort of stone-cold flex that whispered or shouted to friend and foe alike, "Look upon our arches, ye mighty, and despair," when your dome is also a mic drop. Let's begin with the Pantheon, a building that has somehow survived fires, invasions, earthquakes, and countless awkward tourist selfies. The unreinforced concrete dome is still the largest of its kind in the world. No rebar, no steel frame, just pure Roman audacity. When it was completed around 126 AD under Emperor Hadrian, the Pantheon was more than a temple. It was a concrete poem dedicated to Roman ingenuity. Visitors would walk in and look up, their jaws hitting the floor faster than a dropped amphora. The oculus, the open-air eye in the center of the dome, bathed the interior in divine light, as if Jupiter himself had approved the construction. Rome was effectively saying, "Your gods live in wooden huts, ours get skylights, aqueducts, plumbing, but make it empire." Next up, the aqueducts, perhaps the most literal interpretation of concrete as infrastructure and ideology. These marvels weren't just plumbing systems, they were monuments to Roman superiority. Imagine being a Gallic chieftain and watching fresh, clean water arc over the landscape in majestic concrete bridges. You'd start reconsidering your tribal alliances real quick. These structures whispered sweet nothings like, "Not only can we conquer your homeland, we can also deliver water with such elegance that even your livestock feels second class." Rome built over 260 miles of aqueducts, many with towering segments made possible by, you guessed it, concrete. It allowed engineers to push higher, wider, and farther. It was gravity-powered hydration wrapped in limestone swagger. The Colosseum, bread, circuses, and concrete carnage. And then there's the Colosseum, built for 50,000 screaming fans long before the invention of foam fingers. This elliptical death stadium was another masterclass in architectural chest thumping. Why did they need concrete? Because stone alone couldn't support the sheer scale and complexity of the Colosseum's vaulted corridors, trapdoor systems, and vomitoria. Yes, that's a real word. They're exits, not gastric encouragements. Concrete enabled the layered design that allowed quick crowd dispersal. In case someone really didn't enjoy the lion show. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a flex wrapped in blood sport. "Behold," Rome proclaimed, "even our murders are efficiently engineered," building brand Rome. But it wasn't just these mega monuments. Roman governors, emperors, and generals all used concrete to stamp their presence on the map. Temples, forums, basilicas, these were physical hashtags of power. Hadrian was here, but in a 3,000-ton dome rather than graffiti. Every province of the empire featured Roman architecture that looked suspiciously Roman, no matter how far from the Tiber it stood. Gaul, Syria, North Africa, all dotted with arches, domes, and amphitheaters that reminded locals who the big dog was. You could be sipping wine in Britannia and still feel like you were within shouting distance of the Senate. And the beauty of concrete? It didn't just look good, it lasted. Roman buildings outlived the emperors who commissioned them, the citizens who used them, and sometimes even the religions practiced inside them. That's some legacy. Stone-cold marketing strategy. You see, concrete wasn't just a building material, it was Rome's marketing department. Durable, malleable, and scale-friendly. It gave the empire a literal foundation for its greatness, one that could be shaped into domes, arches, aqueducts, and amphitheaters faster and cheaper than traditional stone. More importantly, concrete spoke. It didn't whisper, it bragged. Every building said, "We have mastered nature, we've tamed fire, rock, and water, and just to show off, we made the ceiling round." Today's governments build highways and bridges to improve infrastructure. Romans did that too, but with flair, turning each one into a monument to Roman excellence. It was the ancient equivalent of having both a Wi-Fi router and a bronze bust of yourself in every room. Conclusion: heavy lies the crown, heavier still the dome. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it was built to last and to impress. Concrete was the glue that held together more than buildings. It held together an image, a mythos, an ego the size of the Mediterranean. In the end, it wasn't just concrete that made Roman architecture special. It was how Rome used it, strategically, boldly, and always with the intent to awe. Whether it was water delivery or lion fights, the empire didn't just build, it bragged. And thanks to concrete, it's still bragging. If Roman concrete were a superhero, the Pantheon would be its dramatic, cape-swirling entrance, rising boldly in the heart of Rome for nearly 2,000 years. This majestic structure doesn't just suggest engineering brilliance, it screams it, from the oculus to the portico. And the most jaw-dropping part? That dome. A perfect hemisphere that's still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, balancing gracefully atop ancient columns like it's the most casual feat of architectural gymnastics ever performed. Let's pause for a moment and put that into context. In a world where modern stadiums lean heavily on steel rebar, tension cables, and enough blueprints to make blush, the Romans pulled off a miracle with ash, lime, and a bit of stone rubble. No reinforcement, no steel skeleton hiding underneath, just ancient concrete doing yoga poses modern engineers would break a slide rule over. The dome of the Pantheon spans 43.3 meters. That's about 142 feet for those who measure their pizza in inches. That's not just wide, it's absurdly wide for a dome made without any internal support. Think about it. When the Pantheon was completed around 126 CE under Emperor Hadrian, it was essentially the concrete equivalent of someone bench pressing a chariot while eating grapes, and to this day it remains unbeaten. The fact that it's still standing after earthquakes, wars, clueless tourists, and multiple popes is the architectural equivalent of a mic drop. But how did they pull it off? The secret lies in both design and material genius. The Roman engineers didn't just slap together a massive concrete lid and hope for the best. They crafted it layer by layer, changing the concrete mix as the structure ascended. At the base of the dome, where strength was crucial, the mix was heavy, full of dense basalt and volcanic tuff. But as the dome curved skyward, the aggregates became lighter, pumice, even bits of crushed tile. It's like they were baking a concrete soufflé with a structural PhD. They also employed clever weight-relieving tricks. The coffered ceiling, those iconic square recesses, wasn't just a decorative flourish. It removed tons of unnecessary material, lightening the load without weakening the dome. Think of it as ancient load optimization, except done with hammers and intuition instead of spreadsheets. And then there's the oculus, the dramatic circular hole at the top of the dome. At 9 meters 30 feet across, it's not only the building's only source of natural light, it's also an ingenious structural solution. By not capping the top of the dome, the Romans avoided the most failure-prone part of the structure. No keystone, no stress concentration, just open air, sunlight, and occasionally rain falling gracefully onto the marble floor like nature's own chandelier. What's more impressive is that the Romans didn't just build the Pantheon to last, they built it to awe. This wasn't a hidden bunker or utilitarian structure. It was a temple meant to celebrate the divine and demonstrate the might of the empire. Walking into the rotunda, the ceiling seemingly floating above your head, you're meant to feel small. You're meant to feel that Rome, with its gods, emperors, and concrete, was eternal. And let's be honest, it's doing a better job at being eternal than most empires that came after. Modern engineers, by the way, still gawk at the Pantheon like it just performed a magic trick. Studies have been poured into it, simulations run, concrete samples dissected, and the general consensus is the Romans were either lucky geniuses or geniusly lucky. They had no modern science, yet somehow managed to hit the architectural jackpot, and then did a victory lap by adding a granite-columned portico from Egypt. The Pantheon isn't just a building, it's a flex, a cosmic-level flex that whispers or shouts through the centuries. We understood material science before you even had pencils. It's been converted into a church, looted for its bronze, used as a royal tomb, and yet it still stands, not just physically but symbolically, as the gold standard of architectural ambition. So the next time you see concrete crumbling in a parking garage built in 1985, just remember the Pantheon dome has been shrugging off gravity, time, and meteorological sass since Marcus Aurelius was still doing homework. Roman concrete was one of humanity's greatest hits, and then somehow it got left off the album. For centuries it held up ports, temples, bridges, and domes like it was conjured by Vulcan himself. And then, poof, gone. Like a culinary masterpiece with no surviving recipe card. Roman concrete slipped through the cracks of time, quite literally, leaving medieval builders scratching their heads and muttering, what in Jupiter's name did they mix this stuff with? So how does a civilization capable of pouring a dome the size of a planetarium forget how to mix its own magic mud? Simple. Rome fell. And when Rome fell, it didn't fall quietly. It face-planted into chaos, invasion, and economic collapse. The empire that once stretched from Hadrian's Wall to the banks of the Euphrates crumbled into a mosaic of squabbling kingdoms, each more interested in not dying than in maintaining civic engineering traditions. It wasn't just the concrete that vanished. It was the entire support network of expertise that made it possible. Roman engineers, called architecti, were trained in material science of their day and good old-fashioned trial and error. They didn't just toss pebbles in a bucket and hope. They had quarries, supply chains, and knowledge passed from master to apprentice. When that structure disintegrated, so did the continuity of building wisdom, and to be fair to medieval Europe, they weren't exactly handed a tidy how to build an empire in concrete instruction manual when Rome collapsed. Rome's best minds didn't huddle together and decide to preserve the secret recipe in a golden scroll under the Vatican. No one thought to slap "please don't forget" on their building manuals. Roman knowledge was mostly passed orally or stored in texts that got lost, burned, repurposed as kindling, or stuffed into monasteries where monks prioritized illuminating Bible verses over preserving structural formulas. Complicating things further, Roman concrete wasn't just any concrete. Its key ingredient was pozzolana, a volcanic ash found in abundance around the Bay of Naples. That's not exactly something you can scrape together in the middle of a muddy field in Saxony. Without access to the same geological goodies, even builders who wanted to recreate Roman concrete couldn't, unless they had a friendly volcano on speed dial. By the time the Middle Ages rolled around, building styles had shifted. Stone became king. Gothic cathedrals soared, not on domes, but on pointed arches, flying buttresses, and a deep-seated fear of wide-open ceilings. These structures were architectural marvels in their own right, but they were playing an entirely different game. Concrete was just passé, unfashionable. Like shoulder pads in the early 2000s, it was briefly iconic and then suddenly embarrassing. To make matters worse, when medieval Europeans did try to use mortar or rudimentary concrete, it was a pale, crumbling imitation of what the Romans had pulled off. Lime mortars without volcanic ash set slowly and didn't endure nearly as well. Builders didn't understand the chemical reactions that made Roman concrete stronger over time, or how seawater actually helped it cure into an almost rock-like substance. That's right, Roman concrete laughed in the face of saltwater erosion. Medieval concrete, on the other hand, whimpered and collapsed in the rain. And this was no small historical oversight. The loss of Roman concrete meant the loss of infrastructure superpowers. Ports deteriorated, bridges failed, seawalls eroded, roads weren't the enduring arteries they once were. For 1,000 years, Europe more or less limped through architectural dark ages, occasionally gazing up at the Pantheon and muttering, "How did they do that?" Now some might ask, but didn't they keep any records? Oh, they did, sort of. The Roman writer Vitruvius described building methods in his multi-volume De Architectura, but his explanations were vague, arcane, and occasionally so poetic they made modern scholars want to scream into their blueprints. Reading Vitruvius is like getting a cheesecake recipe that includes the phrase, "Use milk as the moonlight guides you." He meant well, but he wasn't exactly writing a textbook for future masons. And so, we entered a historical irony of epic proportions. A civilization that could build aqueducts across entire empires somehow forgot to leave behind a sticky note with the recipe. Rome had practically invented the concrete age, and then misplaced it like an umbrella at a bathhouse. It wouldn't be until the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution that interest in Roman concrete was reignited. Scientists and engineers started poking around ancient ruins, realizing that something about Roman structures had allowed them to endure far beyond what modern materials could manage. But by then, the original methods were long lost, and the rediscovery would take centuries of analysis, chemical testing, and sheer determination. Still, the question lingers like an unsolved riddle. How do you forget how to build a miracle? Modern concrete is a bit like your high-maintenance friend. Fine in photos, impressive at first glance, but behind the scenes, cracking under pressure, literally. While Roman concrete has survived millennia of war, weather, and wandering tourists, modern concrete often struggles to make it through a few decades without asking for a full-body reconstruction. And the more you compare them, the more today's concrete starts to look like the building equivalent of a flaky Tinder date. So what's going wrong? Let's start with the foundation. Pun fully intended. Modern concrete is typically a mix of cement, usually Portland cement, aggregates like sand and gravel, and water. The mix is efficient, inexpensive and fast to set, great for a parking garage, not so great for eternity. Portland cement, invented in the early 19th century, was a game changer for industrialization, but its genius came with a shelf life. And that shelf life, as it turns out, is usually somewhere between 50 and 100 years. That's less forever home and more temporary suggestion. One major difference lies in how modern concrete deals with internal stress, or more accurately, doesn't. Most modern buildings use reinforced concrete, meaning steel rebar is embedded inside to give it added tensile strength. Think of the rebar as the skeleton inside the concrete body. The problem? Steel and concrete do not always age gracefully together. Steel, as you might have heard, has a bit of a rust problem, and once the rebar starts corroding, especially in areas exposed to water or salt, like bridges and coastal structures, the surrounding concrete begins to crack, spoil, and eventually crumble. It's like sticking a time bomb in the middle of your walls and hoping the clock doesn't start ticking before the warranty runs out. Roman concrete, on the other hand, had no rebar. It didn't need it. Instead, it relied on chemical magic we're only beginning to understand. The key is in the chemistry. While modern concrete tries to be strong and rigid, Roman concrete leaned into its flaws and somehow made them strengths. Through a process scientists have dubbed autogenous healing, Roman concrete actually repairs itself. That's right. It's a building material with self-care habits. When cracks appear in Roman concrete, especially the kind used near the sea, water seeps in and activates dormant lime within the matrix. The lime reacts with the water and surrounding minerals to form new calcium-based compounds, which then seal the crack. It's basically a concrete version of Wolverine from X-Men. Modern concrete, it just sighs, splits a little more, and calls in a contractor. Another reason for modern concrete's fragility is its chemical composition. The manufacturing process of Portland cement involves heating limestone and clay to around 1,450 joules, releasing massive amounts of CO2 in the process. It's one of the largest industrial contributors to greenhouse gases worldwide. The Romans, by contrast, used a far less energy-intensive approach. Their mix included volcanic ash, which not only made the concrete stronger and more durable, but also helped it resist chemical decay over time. Meanwhile, our fast-setting modern concrete may be convenient, but it doesn't stand up well to time, shifting foundations, temperature changes, or the relentless work of water. Concrete structures today are constantly being repaired, patched, or demolished, often decades ahead of schedule. Cities like Boston, Chicago, and Sydney are littered with concrete band-aids on buildings younger than your grandmother's recipe book. And then there's the issue of shrinkage. No, not that kind. We're talking about the water in modern concrete evaporating too quickly. As it dries, concrete shrinks, which creates micro-cracks that later grow into full-blown disasters. Roman concrete, being mixed and placed in a slower, more forgiving environment, was far less prone to this kind of premature stress. To make things worse, modern concrete is designed more for efficiency than endurance. It's optimized for mass production and easy installation, not longevity. Builders are under pressure to finish projects quickly and under budget. And in a world where short-term return on investment reigns supreme, long-lasting materials often lose out to cheaper, faster alternatives. After all, why make something last 2,000 years when you can just rebuild it in 30 and charge for the renovation? The irony, of course, is that in our obsession with innovation, we've accidentally created a version of concrete that is more fragile, more needy, and far less noble than its ancient ancestor. It's like swapping out a loyal old dog for a sleek robot vacuum, shiny, efficient, but constantly needing to be emptied. Modern engineers and chemists are now scrambling to figure out how the Romans did it. Research teams are studying ancient ruins like detectives at a crime scene, hoping to unlock the ancient recipe. Some promising progress has been made, but full replication remains elusive. We know the ingredients, we know the basic process, but the secret sauce, still locked behind 2,000 years of mystery and mortar. For centuries, Roman concrete was like the Stonehenge of building materials. Everyone could see the results, but no one could figure out how it was actually done. And while modern scientists are pretty good at splitting atoms and sending robots to Mars, recreating a 2,000-year-old recipe involving volcanic pebbles and seawater has proven surprisingly tricky. It's like trying to reverse engineer an ancient smoothie by licking the cup. The journey to crack the Roman code began in earnest, once archaeologists and materials scientists realized something strange. Roman concrete wasn't just still standing, it was getting stronger in places where modern concrete would be crying into its expansion joints. The logical conclusion: there must be something deeply weird and wonderful going on inside those millennia-old walls. So researchers got to work. Core samples were taken from ancient Roman sea walls, piers and harbors, specifically the kind of structures that should have dissolved centuries ago but instead looked like they were still waiting for Caesar to show up with a toga and a trident. These samples were ground down, scanned with electron microscopes, subjected to chemical analysis, and in some cases probably treated with more reverence than your average museum artifact. And that's when the magic words started popping up. Aluminum tobermorite. Sounds like a spell, but it's actually a super strong, super rare mineral that forms under very specific conditions. Roman concrete, unlike our modern mix, turns out to grow these crystal structures over time, like the concrete equivalent of developing calluses. Scientists believe this process is triggered by the volcanic ash reacting with seawater, a chemical symphony that our Portland cement-based mixtures don't know how to play. Aluminum tobermorite is not something you find in modern concrete. It's also not something you can just sprinkle in like cinnamon. It grows slowly, over decades, as the minerals in the ash interact with lime and water. In Roman concrete it appears naturally, and it gives the material its freakish durability and ability to heal cracks by forming new mineral bonds over time. Modern concrete, by comparison, tends to sulk and split if it so much as feels a cold breeze or hears thunder in the distance. Researchers at many places have published paper after paper trying to recreate this volcanic symphony in a lab. They've mixed pozzolanic ash with lime and seawater, baked samples in high heat, and even simulated the ancient Roman methods by letting mixtures sit for months in conditions mimicking the Mediterranean. And they've gotten close, very close. But so far, none of the formulas has been a perfect match. Most attempts result in a material that's durable, yes, but not as self-repairing, not as crystalline, and frankly not as impressive as the original. And of course, just to add to the mystery, no one left behind a concrete cookbook, no instructions, no footnotes, no clay tablet titled Concrete for Dummies Empire Edition. That means modern scientists are mostly guessing at ratios and reacting to outcomes like medieval alchemists trying to turn lead into gold. One team even tried mapping every speck of mineral content in ancient samples to figure out what ingredients were present and in what amounts. They discovered that Roman concrete wasn't uniform. It varied from structure to structure, builder to builder. One batch might be loaded with volcanic debris from Mount Vesuvius. Another might use ash from a different region entirely. This variability makes it nearly impossible to say, "Ah yes, this is the recipe," because it turns out the Romans weren't following one recipe, they were just good at adjusting on the fly. Still, progress is being made. Some modern companies are experimenting with Roman-inspired concrete for use in environmentally sustainable projects, hoping that by reducing reliance on carbon-heavy Portland cement and substituting natural volcanic materials, they can both help the planet and create buildings that don't start crumbling before their centennial anniversary. In a time when sustainability is the new imperial conquest, Roman concrete might just be the hero we need. So yes, we're cracking the code, slowly, carefully, one ash speck analysis at a time. And while we might not have nailed it yet, Each discovery brings us closer to understanding how a civilization without rebar, lasers, or even basic indoor plumbing managed to make a material that could outlive empires. It's equal parts archaeology, chemistry, and architectural envy, and it's proof that sometimes the best way forward is to look backward and ask, what would a toga-wearing engineer do? In a world where modern buildings come with warranties shorter than a loaf of bread's shelf life, Roman ruins are still holding meetings with pigeons and charging rent to tourists. Think about it. The Colosseum has survived earthquakes, pollution, medieval looters, and several thousand years of selfie stick wielders. Meanwhile, a concrete parking garage from the 1970s is one sneeze away from demolition. The lesson? Maybe those toga-clad engineers knew something we don't. Roman concrete isn't just an architectural curiosity, it's a legacy of resilience. For centuries it quietly held the empire's infrastructure together. Aqueducts, roads, ports, public baths and temples. But today it's also holding our attention as the world looks for smarter, greener, longer-lasting ways to build. The very thing we used to consider primitive may just be the futuristic solution we've been overlooking while pouring another doomed slab of Portland cement. Here's why it matters. Modern concrete is one of the most used materials on Earth, second only to water. It's also one of the biggest culprits in global carbon emissions. Cement production alone contributes up to 8% of total emissions worldwide, a fact that would probably have had Cicero clutching his scrolls in disbelief. And while today's concrete can be produced quickly and cheaply, it often comes with a built-in expiration date. Cracks, corrosion, and collapse are just part of the deal. Rome's concrete, on the other hand, was designed to last not decades but millennia. That's why in recent years engineers, architects, and eco-conscious innovators have been dusting off their history books. Roman concrete is being re-examined not just as a mystery to solve, but as a model to follow. Researchers are now exploring ways to adapt Roman principles to modern needs. That means incorporating volcanic ash, lime, and even seawater into new formulations, blends that produce less CO2 and develop long-term durability rather than quick-setting fragility. And here's where the legacy gets exciting. Some of these experimental mixes are showing promise, not only in strength but in self-healing capabilities. That's right. Buildings of the future may be able to repair their own cracks just like Roman piers did, growing new mineral bonds over time instead of waiting for a guy with a cork gun and a ladder. You'll now find whispers of Roman inspiration in all kinds of eco-engineering projects, from carbon-negative concrete startups to government-funded research into sustainable urban infrastructure. There's a slow but growing movement to look to the past for solutions to the present. In fact, in coastal engineering, where salt water usually spells doom for modern concrete, Roman-style blends are being reconsidered for seawalls, piers, and breakwaters that won't collapse every time Poseidon sneezes. Even heritage conservation projects are getting involved. Rather than slathering ancient ruins in modern materials that don't age well, scientists are now experimenting with Roman-style mortars that can bond seamlessly with old structures, helping preserve ancient sites without turning them into Frankenstein's castles of incompatible materials. Of course, we're not suggesting we all go back to mixing concrete with donkey carts and lava pebbles, but the principle remains: durability matters, low carbon matters, and understanding natural chemistry can lead to more sustainable cities. The Romans didn't need steel reinforcements or plastic polymers. They had volcanic ash, clever engineering, and an obsession with building things that could survive the ages, which, quite frankly, sounds like a pretty solid philosophy to bring into the climate crisis. The legacy of Roman concrete is that it outlived the very empire that created it. While Rome crumbled, their roads didn't. Their forums are still standing, even as the empires that followed have come and gone like seasonal trends. And today, that legacy is no longer just about what once was. It's about what could be. If we can blend ancient wisdom with modern science, the future of construction might not lie in inventing something new but rediscovering something brilliantly old. So the next time you walk past a cracked sidewalk or spot scaffolding on a new building already falling apart, remember, 2,000 years ago, some Roman engineer in sandals figured out a better way to stick rocks together and we're still trying to catch up, because in a world of crumbling condos, Roman ruins are still renting space in our imaginations.